Hello and welcome to The Long Shadow. How could a man who never ventured beyond the confines of his hometown rise to become the philosopher whose ideas reshaped the very foundations of human thought? Tonight, we embark on a journey tracing the extraordinary life of Immanuel Kant, from his humble beginnings in a craftsman's home to his eventual passing as Europe's most revered intellectual. We will witness his arduous struggle against poverty, his patient 15-year wait for the academic position he so rightfully merited, and his decade-long period of intellectual quietude before he unveiled one of history's most challenging and utterly revolutionary philosophical works. We will observe him deftly navigating the perilous political landscapes dominated by powerful kings and watchful censors. We will come to understand the enduring relevance of his ideas, and how the profound words he penned in an often overlooked Prussian dialect continue to resonate powerfully through our legal systems, our scientific endeavors, and indeed, our very understanding of what it means to be human. Before we fully immerse ourselves in this remarkable journey through the life of one of history's most exceptional thinkers, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and perhaps leave a like. I'm also genuinely curious, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? Do let me know in the comments below. And now settle in. On February 12, 1804, within a modest dwelling on a tranquil street in Königsberg, a man lay drawing his last breath, a man who, remarkably, had never once journeyed beyond the boundaries of his beloved city. He was 79 years old. His once robust body had grown profoundly frail, his eyes, once so piercingly sharp, now appeared clouded and dim. The room itself was simple, almost starkly austere, a fitting environment for an individual who had meticulously ordered his entire existence according to unwavering principles of discipline and duty. A small circle of devoted friends gathered somberly at his bedside. Outside, the biting winter wind swept relentlessly across the Baltic coast, the very same wind that had gusted through this Prussian city for all 8 decades of his long existence. He had known its sound every single day of his life. Soon, he would hear nothing else. The physician leaned in close, offering a calming mixture of wine and water to ease his final passage. The dying man tasted it, paused for a moment, and then uttered his very last words in a voice barely rising above a whisper. "Yes, it's good," he murmured. "It is good." And with that, Immanuel Kant was gone. Indeed, consider the sheer strangeness of the life I have just outlined. Here was a man who, in his entire life, never ventured more than 40 miles from his birthplace. He never laid eyes on the vast expanse of the ocean, despite it being merely a day's journey away. He never scaled a mountain, nor did he ever visit the grand capitals of Europe, Berlin, Paris, London, or Rome. He never beheld the continent's magnificent art collections. He never stood in the august presence of kings, nor did he ever walk the hallowed halls of the foreign universities that so eagerly sought his presence. He courteously declined every single invitation, rejected every opportunity to depart. And yet, from this singular, provincial town, this humble harness-maker's son managed to utterly rewrite the fundamental rules of human knowledge. He shattered fundamental assumptions that had stood unchallenged for 2 millennia. He profoundly transformed how we comprehend the nature of the mind, the essence of morality, the concept of beauty, the tenets of religion, and even the very possibility of objective truth. His revolutionary ideas would go on to shape political revolutions, inspire the drafting of constitutions, and exert an indelible influence on every major philosopher who succeeded him. 2 centuries later, we continue to think within the very categories and frameworks he invented, often without even realizing we are doing so, without even knowing his name. But to truly grasp how Immanuel Kant evolved into the towering figure he became, we cannot merely begin with his weighty volumes. Instead, we must start with a place. We must immerse ourselves in understanding the world that forged him, a world defined by rigid social hierarchies, fervent religious faith, and a city nestled precariously at the very edge of European civilization. The Königsberg of Kant's childhood was certainly no bustling metropolis, no rival to the likes of Paris or London. Yet, it was far from an insignificant backwater. It served as a vital trading hub, a respected university town, a steadfast fortress of Lutheran piety, and the administrative capital of East Prussia. It was a city characterized by its numerous churches and industrious merchants, by its earnest scholars and disciplined soldiers, by a rigidly enforced social order, and by a simmering, quiet intellectual ambition. And it was in 1724, within a modest neighborhood where diligent craftsmen made their homes, that a child was born, a child who would never depart, and indeed, would never need to. To truly comprehend how Immanuel Kant ascended to become the most influential philosopher of the modern age, we must first deeply understand the intricate world he was born into, a world of unyielding faith, unbending hierarchy, and a small Prussian city that would, in time, become his entire, boundless universe. Königsberg itself was strategically positioned where the Prego River gracefully flowed into the Baltic Sea, a picturesque city adorned with sturdy stone bridges and soaring Gothic spires, bustling with the activity of merchant ships and the disciplined presence of military garrisons. The magnificent castle that bestowed its name upon the city, Königsberg, literally, the King's Mountain, loomed majestically over the skyline, a constant, imposing reminder that this was staunch Prussian territory, governed from distant Berlin by kings who held order, discipline, and the unwavering Lutheran faith above all other considerations. In that pivotal year of 1724, the city was home to an estimated 50,000 inhabitants. It was a place that could be described as prosperous, yet not grand, cultured, yet not truly cosmopolitan. The university, established back in 1544, drew scholars from across Protestant Europe. Nevertheless, it largely remained a provincial institution, geographically and intellectually distant from the truly great intellectual centers of that era. The city's streets were typically narrow, its winters notoriously harsh, and its social order unyieldingly rigid. Indeed, everyone knew their predetermined place within this intricate structure. At the very apex of this society stood the nobility and the high-ranking officials of the Prussian state. Beneath them were the prosperous merchants, whose wealth came from trading in valuable amber, grain, and timber. Next in line were the master craftsmen, the industrious shopkeepers, and the clerks. And at the lowest rung were the laborers, the servants, and the unfortunate poor. In the neighborhood known as the Saddler's Quarter, where artisans skilled in working with leather established their homes, resided a family of modest means and deeply devout habits. Johann Georg Kant was a harness maker, a dedicated craftsman who spent his days meticulously cutting and stitching leather to fashion the essential equipment horses required for pulling carriages and plows. It was honest, respectable work, certainly, but it firmly positioned his family within the lower echelons of the city's intricate social hierarchy. There was no inherited wealth here, no influential connections to power, and certainly no obvious, preordained path to distinction. Johann Georg had married a woman named Anna Regina Reuter, herself the daughter of another harness maker. They were, by all accounts, perfectly matched, both hard-working, deeply pious, and utterly committed to raising their children within the strict, unyielding traditions of their faith. They would eventually welcome 9 children into their lives, though, tragically, not all would survive to reach adulthood. Indeed, infant mortality was a grim and constant presence in 18th-century life, a somber shadow that perpetually loomed over every single cradle. On April 22, 1724, Anna Regina gave birth to her 4th child, a son. They bestowed upon him the name Immanuel, a Hebrew name profoundly meaning God is with us. It was more than a name, it was a powerful statement of faith, a silent prayer embedded within his very identity. At that moment, the family could have had no inkling of what this child would ultimately become. There was absolutely nothing in their humble circumstances to even remotely suggest that this particular infant, born in this specific neighborhood, would one day be remembered long after kings and generals had faded into obscurity. The baptism ceremony occurred just 2 days later at the local church. The ancient records of this event still exist, revealing an ordinary family performing a deeply ordinary ritual, warmly welcoming a new soul into the Christian community, just as their ancestors had done for countless generations before them. The baby was healthy, the parents profoundly grateful, and the future, as yet, entirely unwritten. Young Immanuel would grow up within these narrow, winding streets, enveloped by the rhythmic sounds of his father's workshop and the steady rhythms of a diligent, working-class household. He would learn early in life that existence demanded unwavering discipline, that idleness was considered a grievous sin, and that one's profound duty to God and to one's neighbor had to take precedence over any fleeting personal comfort. These were not merely the values of his parents, they were the bedrock values of their entire community, the very principles that would, as he later reflected and wrote, fundamentally shape everything he ever conceived. But the Kant household was not solely defined by its modest trade. It was shaped, even more profoundly, by something far more powerful, a form of Christianity so intensely personal, so utterly demanding of moral perfection, that it would leave an indelible mark on the young Immanuel for the rest of his life. In the early 18th century, a fervent religious movement began to sweep through the Lutheran communities of Germany. It was known as Pietism, and it irrevocably transformed the spiritual lives of millions. The Pietists firmly believed that official Lutheranism had, over time, grown spiritually cold, that the established church had become excessively preoccupied with rigid doctrine and empty ritual, showing too little concern for the vibrant inner spiritual life. They yearned for something far deeper, a profoundly personal, emotional, and truly transformative relationship with God. Pietism, therefore, demanded relentless self-examination. Believers were expected to meticulously scrutinize their own hearts, to diligently search for the slightest trace of sin in every thought and desire, and to cultivate a profound moral seriousness that permeated every single corner of their daily lives. Prayer was not merely a Sunday obligation, it was a constant, interwoven practice. Bible study was not passive listening, it was an active, engaged pursuit. The ultimate goal was nothing short of the complete reformation of the individual soul. Anna Regina Kant was, indeed, a devoted pietist. Her faith was anything but casual or conventional. It was, in fact, the central organizing principle of her entire existence. She viewed religious instruction as the fundamental cornerstone of everything her children would ever need to confront the world. From their very earliest years, she thoroughly immersed them in Scripture, in prayer, and in the rigorous discipline of moral reflection. Young Immanuel, in particular, became her special project. She recognized something truly unique in him, a remarkable sensitivity, an acute intelligence, and an innate capacity for profound thought that clearly distinguished him from his siblings. She often took him on long, contemplative walks through the serene countryside surrounding Königsberg, seizing every opportunity to teach and to inspire. When they gazed up at the vast, wondrous night sky, she did not merely name the constellations. Instead, she elucidated that this immense, perfectly ordered universe was undeniably the magnificent handiwork of God, and furthermore, that the very same divine power that precisely hung the stars in their celestial courses had also carefully inscribed a profound moral law within the depths of the human heart. These walks, these profound lessons, would remain with Kant forever. Indeed, decades later, at the conclusion of his greatest philosophical work, he would immortalize the words that effectively became his epitaph. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. The unmistakable echo of his mother's deeply felt teaching resounds clearly in these lines. The entire household atmosphere was steeped in earnest, unwavering devotion. Each day invariably began and concluded with prayer. The children meticulously memorized Scripture. They were diligently taught to constantly examine their consciences, to openly confess their faults, and to strive relentlessly, always, for continuous moral improvement. There was, undeniably, warmth within this home. Anna Regina loved her children with profound depth. Yet, there was also a relentless, underlying expectation. It was not deemed enough simply to be a good person, one had to be perpetually striving, always becoming better. This rigorous upbringing left an indelible, permanent mark on Kant. As an adult, he would indeed drift away from the confines of organized religion. He would come to deeply distrust empty ritual and unequivocally reject the supernatural claims of traditional Christianity. However, he never once abandoned the profound moral seriousness that his mother had so carefully instilled within him. His entire philosophical project can, in fact, be understood as a monumental attempt to preserve the vital ethical core of Pietism, that unwavering sense of absolute duty, that profound commitment to moral self-examination, while crucially regrounding it in the solid bedrock of human reason, rather than relying on divine revelation. Late in his life, Kant often spoke of his mother to his closest friends and biographers. His voice, typically precise and controlled, would noticeably soften, and his eyes would grow distant, lost in remembrance. He consistently referred to her memory as sacred, a word he employed for almost no other person or concept. He said she had planted and nurtured the first seed of good in me and opened my heart to the impressions of nature. Whatever else he grew to be, whatever intricate philosophical abstractions he later meticulously developed, he never, ever forgot the woman who had first taught him to gaze up at the stars and truly wonder. Anna Regina Kant had bestowed upon her son the invaluable gift of profound moral seriousness, but tragically, she would not live to witness the extraordinary ways he would employ it. In 1737, when Immanuel was merely 13 years old, the very center of his nascent world vanished forever. December of 1737 was, as it invariably was, bitterly cold in Königsberg. The Prigo River froze solid. The narrow streets fell quiet, and within the Kant household, Anna Regina lay gravely ill. We do not know precisely what ailment claimed her. The medical records of 18th-century harness makers' wives were, sadly, not meticulously preserved. What we do know is that she died, and that her passing shattered something profound within her 13-year-old son, a wound that would never fully heal. Immanuel was away at school when this tragedy struck, attending the Collegium Fridericinum, the elite pietist academy where he had been enrolled for 5 years. Perhaps he was able to return home in time to bid his farewells, perhaps not. The historical record, unfortunately, remains silent on these deeply intimate details. What we do know is the devastating aftermath: a household suddenly bereft of its spiritual heart, a father left alone to raise the surviving children, and a sensitive, brilliant boy abruptly cast adrift in a world that had lost its guiding light. Anna Regina had been far more than just a mother to Immanuel. She had served as his very first teacher, his gentle guide to the wonders of the natural world, and his crucial window into the moral universe. The long walks they had shared together, the profound conversations held beneath the vast canvas of the stars, the quiet moments of instruction and encouragement, all of this now existed only as cherished, bittersweet memories. At an age when most children are still tentatively forming their fundamental sense of the world, Kant tragically lost the person who had, above all others, most profoundly shaped his burgeoning spirit. How, indeed, does a child truly process such a monumental loss? We can only speculate. Kant himself, throughout his published writings, very rarely touched upon his own emotions. He was famously reserved, famously controlled, and notoriously reluctant to reveal the depths of his inner life. But the few precious glimpses we do possess are remarkably telling. When he spoke of his mother to his closest friends late in his life, more than 60 years after her passing, his voice would noticeably soften. His characteristic composure would momentarily slip. He continued to refer to her memory as sacred, a word he employed for almost no other person or concept. Some biographers have compellingly suggested that this profound, early loss explains a great deal about Kant's adult character, his distinct emotional distance, his marked reluctance to form deeply intimate attachments, and his lifelong decision never to marry. Perhaps the boy who suffered the immense loss of his mother learned, from that tender age, to protect himself by keeping others at arm's length. Perhaps the intense pain of that first great love and its abrupt, devastating ending rendered him forever wary of ever loving so deeply again. This, of course, remains speculation. We cannot, with any certainty, psychoanalyze the dead. Yet, we can certainly observe a distinct pattern: a man who consistently valued duty over raw emotion, who wrote about morality with often cold, intellectual precision but very rarely about the complexities of love, a man who surrounded himself with a circle of friends and esteemed colleagues, yet meticulously kept his deepest self hidden. The profound roots of that pattern may well lie here, in a bitter Königsberg winter, when a 13-year-old boy first learned that the people we cherish most can be snatched from us without the slightest warning. Life within the household, in its pragmatic way, continued. Johann Georg, his father, undoubtedly did his utmost. But something irreplaceable was profoundly gone. The contemplative walks under the stars had ceased. The gentle voice that had first taught Immanuel to wonder at the universe was now, tragically, silent. And the boy who was destined to become the greatest philosopher of his age was now left to painstakingly forge his own path forward, alone. Even prior to his mother's untimely death, Kant had been sent away to an institution that would rigorously test the very essence of everything she had lovingly taught him. It was a school so notoriously severe that he would later vividly describe his years there as akin to a form of enslavement. In 1732, when Immanuel Kant was just 8 years old, a perceptive family friend recognized the child's exceptional nature. Franz Albert Schultz, a theologian, a pietist minister, and crucially, the director of Königsberg's most rigorous educational establishment, the Collegium Fridericianum, had observed young Immanuel within the Kant household. He had discerned something truly unusual, a remarkable quickness of mind, an extraordinary depth of attention, and an innate capacity for learning that distinctly set the boy apart from his peers. Schultz successfully convinced Johann Georg and Anna Regina that their son truly deserved an education far beyond what a humble harness maker's household could ever hope to provide. The Collegium Fridericianum was an elite Latin school, meticulously designed to prepare the sons of the Prussian middle class for university entrance, and ultimately, for distinguished careers in either the church or the civil service. It offered a classical education of truly extraordinary rigor, encompassing subjects such as Latin, Greek, Hebrew, theology, rhetoric, logic, and a deep engagement with the ancient texts that formed the very bedrock of European learning. For a family like the Kants, whose financial means were undeniably limited, securing a place at the Collegium was a profoundly significant achievement. It opened academic and social doors that would otherwise have remained firmly, irrevocably closed. However, the school was also a deeply pietist institution, and pietist education, by its very nature, was anything but gentle. Each grueling day commenced precisely at 5:30 in the morning with communal prayer. Classes then followed, hour after relentless hour, with very little in the way of relief. The demanding curriculum was overwhelmingly dominated by intensive religious instruction and the rigorous study of classical languages, which were meticulously drilled into the students through incessant repetition, rote memorization, and unyielding discipline. Latin, in particular, was not merely a subject to be studied, it was, in essence, to be lived. Students were rigorously expected to speak it, to think in it, and to write in it. The ultimate goal was nothing less than complete, effortless fluency, the kind of profound mastery that would enable a scholar to read the complex prose of Cicero as easily and naturally as his morning newspaper. Recreation, conversely, was viewed with profound suspicion. Play was considered idle, and idleness, in the stern pietist worldview, was unequivocally the devil's workshop. The profound pietist emphasis on moral self-examination, which Anna Regina had fostered with such warmth and tenderness at home, unfortunately took on a significantly harder, more unforgiving edge at the Collegium. Students were relentlessly expected to monitor not merely their outward actions, but also their most private thoughts. They were expected to confess not only their transgressions but also their very sinful inclinations, living in a constant state of relentless spiritual vigilance. For a sensitive child, this relentless self-scrutiny could be utterly exhausting. For a brilliant child with an inherently questioning mind, it was nothing short of suffocating. Kant spent 8 years at the Collegium, from age 8 to 16. While he excelled academically, his exceptional abilities recognized by all, he harbored no fondness for these years. Late in life, he spoke of his time there with a sentiment bordering on bitterness. He famously characterized the entire experience as the slavery of youth. He deeply resented the mechanical piety, the seemingly endless religious exercises, and the stifling suppression of natural curiosity. The school had certainly provided him with an extraordinary education, but it had also, perhaps unintentionally, instilled in him a lifelong suspicion of organized religion. The irony of this outcome is profound. The Collegium Fridericianum, with its intense pietist fervor and its unwavering demand for moral seriousness, shaped Kant in fundamental ways that would endure forever. The discipline, the intellectual rigor, and the rigorous training in logic and argumentation that he received there became the foundational tools of his later philosophical method. The moral earnestness, once stripped of its supernatural trappings, evolved into the very bedrock of his ethical framework. The very institution that he came to resent also forged the man he was to become. Yet something crucial was still missing. The Collegium taught Kant to obey, to memorize, and to conform. What it emphatically did not teach him was how to truly think for himself. That vital lesson would have to await his final departure from the school's gates and his entrance into a profoundly different world, a world where ideas could be freely questioned, where authority could be openly challenged, and where a young man could, at last, begin to genuinely think. At 16, Kant effectively escaped the Collegium and entered a distinctly new environment, the University of Königsberg, a place where ideas flowed without constraint, and where a young man could finally embark on the journey of independent thought. In the autumn of 1740, a 16-year-old Immanuel Kant passed through the gates of the Albertina, the University of Königsberg, and stepped into a world unlike anything he had ever known. In that same year, a new king ascended the Prussian throne. Frederick II, who would later be known as Frederick the Great, was a monarch of highly unusual interests, a celebrated patron of the arts, a frequent correspondent of Voltaire, and a man who unequivocally valued intellectual inquiry over rigid religious orthodoxy. His reign would usher in a period of unprecedented intellectual openness across Prussian society, and Kant would emerge as one of its most significant beneficiaries. The contrast with the Collegium was immediate and striking. Where the school had demanded strict conformity, the university enthusiastically invited inquiry. Where the school had treated doubt as a sin, the university embraced it as a fundamental method of intellectual exploration. Students were still expected to master classical languages and Christian theology, but they were now also exposed to the burgeoning new philosophies and sciences that were actively transforming European thought. Kant initially enrolled as a theology student, which was the expected and often only viable path for a poor yet talented young man from a pietist background. However, his interests rapidly expanded far beyond the confines of the pulpit. He discovered a deep passion for mathematics. He became utterly fascinated by natural philosophy, what we would now identify as physics, and found himself drawn irresistibly to the profound metaphysical questions that had captivated thinkers since antiquity. What is the fundamental nature of reality? What truths can we truly know with certainty? And, most importantly, how should we live our lives? The pivotal figure who opened these intellectual doors for Kant was a young professor named Martin Knudsen. Only 10 years older than his eager student, Knudsen was a rising star at the university, a man who combined deep scholarly learning with an infectious, genuine enthusiasm for new ideas. He introduced Kant to two powerful intellectual traditions that would ultimately shape every aspect of his later philosophical writings. The first was the systematic rationalism espoused by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and his prominent follower Christian Wolff. These philosophers firmly believed that human reason, when properly applied, held the key to unlocking all the secrets of the universe. They constructed elaborate metaphysical systems, meticulously attempting to explain everything from the very nature of God to the behavior of matter, all through the power of pure logical deduction. It was a grand, incredibly ambitious, and supremely confident vision of what the human mind was capable of achieving. The second tradition was the empirical science pioneered by Isaac Newton. Newton's revolutionary physics had fundamentally transformed the European understanding of the natural world. He had brilliantly demonstrated that the majestic motions of the planets, the simple fall of an apple, and the powerful tides of the ocean could all be elegantly explained by a single, coherent set of mathematical laws. This was not mere speculation or mysticism. It was knowledge firmly grounded in direct observation and rigorously confirmed by precise prediction. For a young man ardently hungry for truth, Newton's remarkable achievement was nothing short of intoxicating. Kant would dedicate the remainder of his life to trying to reconcile these two seemingly disparate visions, the rationalist faith that pure reason alone could attain ultimate truths, and the empiricist insistence that all genuine knowledge must be firmly grounded in sensory experience. The inherent tension between Leibniz and Newton, between abstract philosophy and concrete science, between contemplation from an armchair and experimentation in a laboratory, would ultimately become the dynamic engine of his profound thought. Under Knudsen's inspiring guidance, Kant truly flourished. He proved to be a serious student, diligent and exceptionally capable, but also increasingly independent in his intellectual pursuits. He began to develop his own distinctive ideas, formulate his own penetrating questions, and cultivate his unique style of thinking. These university years were a period of intense intellectual awakening, a profound liberation from the constraints of his childhood, and an exciting discovery of possibilities he had never before imagined. However, the young scholar's dreams of a secure academic life were soon to be tragically shattered by a severe crisis that struck directly at the heart of his family. In 1746, Kant's father died. And quite suddenly, everything in Immanuel's world changed. Johann Georg Kant, the harness maker, died in 1746. The elder Kant had worked tirelessly his entire life, providing for his family as best he could, and instilling in his children the core values of duty and discipline that would come to define his most famous son. However, he had not been able to leave behind any wealth. There was no inheritance, no savings, and crucially, no patron to support a promising young scholar through the final, crucial years of his university studies. Immanuel was 22 years old. He had not yet completed his degree, and suddenly he confronted a stark and inescapable reality. There was absolutely no money to continue his education. The path he had so carefully imagined for himself, a life dedicated to scholarship, to teaching, to the pursuit of ideas at the university, now seemed to close abruptly before him. Königsberg was not a wealthy city, and the Kant family possessed no connections to the powerful or influential. A poor student without a patron had very few viable options. He could completely abandon his intellectual ambitions, find some other trade, and simply accept that his years at the university had been a pleasant but ultimately fruitless interlude. Or he could somehow find a way to survive while steadfastly keeping his intellectual dreams alive. The solution he found was common but deeply humbling. Kant would become a private tutor, working in the households of wealthy families. It was a respectable position, certainly better than manual labor, but it came with its own unique set of burdens. A tutor occupied an ambiguous social space, neither a servant nor an equal. He lived within the household, often ate at the family's table, but was perpetually aware of his dependent status. He was paid to instruct children in their letters, their numbers, and their Latin grammar, subjects far below the level of his own profound interests and formidable abilities. Moreover, he was intellectually isolated, cut off from the vibrant academic community of the university, effectively exiled to rural manor houses where the life of the mind was considered a mere luxury that few truly valued. For a young man who had experienced the intellectual excitement of Knudsen's lectures, who had begun to formulate his own original philosophical ideas, and who had dreamed of making significant contributions to the great conversations of European thought, this was a bitter and difficult descent. He was certainly not the first promising scholar to have his path derailed by poverty, and he would not be the last. But he faced a critical choice. Would he allow his circumstances to defeat him, or would he find a way to persevere? Kant chose to keep going. In the autumn of 1746, he left Königsberg for the Prussian countryside. He would not return for nearly a decade. The future author of the Critique of Pure Reason, the man who would fundamentally reshape Western philosophy, was about to spend 9 long years teaching children in isolated rural manor houses, waiting for an opportunity that might never arrive. For nearly a decade, the future author of the Critique of Pure Reason would be teaching children their ABCs in rural manor houses. But even in this intellectual exile, his mind never ceased its relentless work. The years between 1746 and 1755 constitute the least documented period of Kant's life. We know the basic outlines. He worked as a private tutor in 3 different households, all situated in the countryside surrounding Königsberg. We know the names of these families: the Anders household near Uden, the von Hulsen household in Ansdorf, and the von Esseling household near Ber. Beyond these sparse facts, the specific details remain elusive. What was this life truly like? We can piece together an image from the customs of the era and the few fragments that have survived. A private tutor occupied a peculiar and often awkward social position. He was highly educated, frequently more so than his employers, yet he remained an employee nonetheless. He lived within the household, often taking his meals with the family or sometimes separately, and dedicated his days to instructing children of various ages and abilities. The work was inherently repetitive, the same Latin conjugations, the same arithmetic tables, the same passages of scripture, year after year. For a brilliant young man brimming with ambitious ideas, it must have been tedious beyond measure. The countryside surrounding Königsberg was flat and windswept, dotted with scattered farms and manor houses. The distinct seasons dictated the rhythm of life: frigid, frozen winters when travel was arduous, and brief, vibrant summers when the land burst forth in green. The intellectual isolation during this time was profound. There were no bustling coffee houses where intellectuals gathered for lively debates. No well-stocked libraries boasted the latest publications. No esteemed colleagues were available with whom to test and refine burgeoning ideas. Kant was truly alone with his thoughts in a way that few individuals ever experience. Yet he did not waste these years. Every spare moment was diligently devoted to reading and profound thinking. The households where he worked often possessed libraries, and Kant voraciously devoured whatever books he could find there. He diligently kept notebooks, meticulously jotting down ideas, and worked through complex problems that had no immediate practical application. He was, in essence, preparing himself for something significant, though he could not yet fully comprehend what that might be. During these years, Kant managed to write his first book, although he would not publish it until his eventual return to Königsberg. The work explored the physical forces of nature, precisely the kind of natural philosophy that had captivated him since his student days. The mere fact that he produced it at all, given his challenging circumstances, stands as a testament to his extraordinary discipline. The years spent as a tutor also imparted to Kant valuable skills that would serve him well later in life. He learned how to explain difficult concepts simply, a practical necessity when teaching children, and a virtue that would later make him an immensely popular lecturer. He also learned to keenly observe human nature within the intimate confines of domestic life, a rich source of material he would later utilize in his writings on anthropology. Furthermore, he developed the social graces that would allow him, despite his humble origins, to become a welcome and esteemed guest at the dinner tables of Königsberg's elite. The families he worked for seemed to have recognized his unusual qualities. The von Kaiserlings, in particular, maintained a warm friendship with Kant long after his tutoring days were over. They were able to see past the conventional role of a servant teacher to the truly exceptional mind that lay beneath. But 9 years is an extraordinarily long time to wait. 9 years of teaching Latin verbs to often indifferent children. 9 years of observing the dynamic academic world from a frustrating distance. 9 years of constant wondering whether the longed-for chance would ever materialize. Lesser spirits might have simply given up. Kant, however, held on. In 1755, the long wait finally ended. In 1755, Kant at last returned to Königsberg, bringing with him a completed doctoral dissertation and a bold ambition to become a professor at the very university that had once been his cherished intellectual home. However, the path ahead would prove to be far longer and considerably harder than he could ever have imagined. Immanuel Kant returned to Königsberg in 1755, nearly a decade after his departure. He was 31 years old. The young student who had left with nothing but an incomplete degree and highly uncertain prospects now came back with tangible accomplishments from his years of exile, a finished manuscript, a mind sharpened by relentless study, and an undiminished ambition. His immediate first task was to fulfill the formal requirements for a proper academic career. In April of 1755, Kant successfully defended his doctoral dissertation, a work titled A Brief Outline of Some Meditations on Fire. It was a treatise on natural philosophy, meticulously examining the physical properties of fire and heat, precisely the kind of scientific investigation that had fascinated him since his student days with Knudsen. The work was competent, learned, and academically sound, yet ultimately unremarkable. It clearly demonstrated Kant's capacity for rigorous scholarship, but it did not yet hint at the profound intellectual revolution that he would later unleash. However, earning a doctorate was only the initial step. To teach at a German university, a scholar required an additional, more advanced qualification, the habilitation. This process necessitated writing a second, more substantial thesis, publicly defending it, and unequivocally demonstrating comprehensive mastery of the subject one intended to teach. In September of 1755, Kant submitted his habilitation thesis, titled, A New Elucidation of the First Principles of Metaphysical Cognition. This work was considerably more ambitious, directly engaging with the deepest questions of metaphysics, and clearly showcasing a young thinker beginning to discover and articulate his own unique philosophical voice. The thesis was accepted, and Kant was now formally qualified to teach at the University of Königsberg. But here was the crucial catch: he became a Privatdozent, not a full professor. The distinction was absolutely crucial. A professor held a salaried position, formally appointed by the university and paid by the state, enjoying considerable security and prestige. A Privatdozent, on the other hand, held no official position at all. He was merely licensed to teach. His entire income was derived solely from the fees that students voluntarily paid to attend his lectures. If no students attended, he earned nothing. If the classroom was full, he might manage to scrape by financially. But there was no security, no guarantee of income, and no safety net beneath which he could not fall. Kant had certainly escaped the isolated manor houses, but he had not yet arrived at true financial or professional safety. For the next 15 years, from 1755 to 1770, Kant would remain in this precarious position. He taught constantly, sometimes delivering as many as 20 hours of lectures per week, covering an astonishingly diverse range of subjects: logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, physics, mathematics, geography, and anthropology. He even taught specialized courses on the theory of fortifications. He offered courses on pyrotechnics. He taught whatever subjects students would pay to hear, because every single course fee represented money he desperately needed to survive. And through it all, he patiently waited. He waited for a coveted professorship to open up. He watched as prestigious chairs were awarded to other men, some arguably more qualified, some less so, and some simply better connected. He was offered positions at other universities, but he steadfastly refused to leave Königsberg. The city that had been his entire world remained his entire world. He was determined to have a professorship in his own university, or he would not have one at all. The protracted waiting would test his patience to its absolute breaking point. Yet Kant did not simply wait passively. He wrote, he taught, he thought, and he published. And before he became universally known as a philosopher, he made his first significant mark on the world as something entirely different, a scientist with a radical new theory about the very origins of the universe. In the same year that Kant submitted his doctoral dissertation, he published a groundbreaking book that would have secured his reputation even if he had never penned another word of philosophy. Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens appeared in 1755, when its author was just 31 years old. It was not a work of careful, cautious scholarship in the traditional sense. It was an audacious act of intellectual daring, a young man's ambitious attempt to explain the origin and intricate structure of the entire universe. The central idea was breathtaking in its immense scope. Kant proposed that the solar system had not always existed in its current, organized form. Rather, he suggested that billions of years ago, there was only a vast, rotating cloud of gas and dust, a primordial nebula slowly spinning in the cosmic void. Over immense stretches of time, gravity inexorably pulled this diffuse material together. The central mass condensed to form the sun. The remaining matter gradually flattened into a disk, and within that disk, planets slowly but surely formed, each one coalescing from the swirling particles around it. This was the revolutionary nebular hypothesis. Kant, at that time, simply lacked the sophisticated mathematical frameworks required to rigorously prove his hypotheses. That monumental work would ultimately be accomplished decades later by the esteemed French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, who, notably, developed the very same ideas entirely independently. Yet, the foundational insight undeniably belonged to Kant, and it proved to be remarkably accurate. Indeed, much of modern planetary science continues to build upon the robust intellectual bedrock he established in his truly remarkable early work. However, Kant's intellectual curiosity did not cease there. His profound imagination ventured far beyond the confines of our solar system, exploring the vast expanse of the cosmos itself. He daringly speculated that the Milky Way, our own home galaxy, was certainly not the sole grand assemblage of stars in the entire universe. Those enigmatic, faint, and somewhat fuzzy patches of light that astronomers of his era observed through their rudimentary telescopes, what they then termed nebulae, might, he proposed, actually be other distinct galaxies altogether. He envisioned these as vast island universes, each an immense collection of stars, separated from our own by truly unimaginable cosmic distances. This groundbreaking idea, however, would remain unconfirmed for another century and a half, until the 1920s, when astronomer Edwin Hubble definitively demonstrated that the Andromeda Nebula was, in fact, a separate, distant galaxy. Kant had astutely posited this concept nearly 2 centuries beforehand. His inquisitive mind also turned to the profound question of life beyond Earth. He pondered that if the same fundamental physical laws governed phenomena throughout the universe, there seemed to be no logical reason for our planet to be utterly unique in harboring life. He mused that perhaps the other worlds orbiting our Sun, and indeed the countless planets circling other stars, might well harbor their own diverse forms of existence. He even speculated on the potential nature of such extraterrestrial beings, contemplating how their intelligence might diverge from our own, and how their moral development could progress. These were precisely the kinds of speculative questions that science fiction writers would eagerly delve into some 200 years later. Yet, remarkably, Kant was grappling with these profound cosmic inquiries in an era characterized by powdered wigs, elegant horse-drawn carriages, and a vastly more limited understanding of the universe. Furthermore, Kant deeply contemplated the immense age of the cosmos itself. The universe, he firmly believed, was not merely a few thousand years old, as a strictly literal interpretation of religious scripture of the time often suggested. Instead, he argued it was ancient beyond the grasp of human comprehension, and crucially, it was still actively evolving. He understood that stars were continuously born, lived out their lives, and eventually died. Galaxies formed, shifted, and transformed over vast timescales. For Kant, the cosmos was not a static, immutable creation, but rather a dynamic, ever-unfolding process spanning countless eons. From where, then, did these extraordinary ideas originate? Kant was, of course, systematically building upon the groundbreaking physics of Isaac Newton, adeptly applying the universal laws of gravity and motion to address the most profound and expansive questions conceivable about the universe. But beyond this scientific foundation, he was also drawing from an even deeper, more personal wellspring, the profound sense of cosmic wonder that his mother had carefully nurtured within him during those formative childhood walks beneath the vast, star-strewn skies. The boy who had been taught to perceive God's majestic hand at work in the heavens had matured into a young man who, in those very same celestial expanses, now recognized an endless and exhilarating frontier for rigorous scientific inquiry and exploration. Kant's remarkable book was dedicated to Frederick the Great, the newly crowned Prussian king, whom Kant perceived as a beacon of hope for fostering intellectual freedom. However, this dedication, unfortunately, achieved very little practical benefit. Tragically, the publisher declared bankruptcy shortly after the book's release, leading to the seizure of most copies by creditors before they could even be widely distributed to the public. Thus, Kant's ambitious first major work effectively vanished, sinking almost without a trace from public view. It would only be rediscovered and appreciated much later, after Kant had achieved widespread fame for his other, more celebrated philosophical contributions. Eventually, scholars would come to recognize it as a truly pioneering and foundational work of cosmology, a document that offered a rare glimpse into a more imaginative and speculative side of Kant, a dimension often obscured by the rigorous, dry prose of his later philosophical treatises. Here, indeed, was a thinker capable of dreaming on the most monumental scale, a mind that could gaze upon the night sky and perceive not merely its inherent beauty, but also a complex, captivating puzzle ripe for scientific elucidation. The young scientist had certainly demonstrated his immense intellectual capabilities. Yet, the aspiring philosopher still urgently required a stable academic position, and the protracted wait for a coveted professorship would inevitably push his patience to its absolute breaking point. At this juncture, in 1755, Kant was 31 years old. Newly qualified and eager to teach at the University of Königsberg, Kant arrived armed with an impressive doctoral dissertation, a meticulously crafted habilitation thesis, and a pioneering cosmological treatise, accomplishments that would have filled any ambitious scholar with immense pride. Consequently, he had every legitimate reason to anticipate that a professorship would swiftly follow. However, this was not to be the case. For the ensuing 15 years, Kant endured as a private docent, an unsalaried lecturer whose livelihood depended entirely on the modest fees students paid to attend his courses. There was no fixed salary, no secure pension, and absolutely no job security. If student enrollment declined, so too did his meager income. Should he fall ill and be unable to teach, he earned precisely nothing. It was an alarmingly precarious existence, one that relentlessly stretched on, year after arduous year. In order to survive this challenging financial reality, Kant was compelled to teach constantly, carrying a truly staggering course load. In a typical semester, he might simultaneously deliver lectures on a diverse array of subjects, including logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, natural theology, physics, mathematics, and physical geography. He also offered popular courses on anthropology, delving into the study of human nature, which vividly drew upon his extensive reading about distant lands and intriguing foreign customs. Remarkably, he even taught specialized courses on the theory of fortifications and on pyrotechnics, subjects with clear military applications that predictably attracted many students preparing for careers within the Prussian army. Delivering 20 hours of lectures per week was not at all unusual for Kant. Sometimes, his schedule demanded even more. Each individual course demanded significant preparation, the actual delivery of engaging lectures, and the constant hope that a sufficient number of students would enroll to justify the considerable effort. It was undeniably exhausting work, yet Kant plunged into it with truly remarkable energy and dedication, and indeed, students did come. Kant became a genuinely popular lecturer, highly regarded for his exceptional clarity, his occasional brilliant flashes of wit, and his profound ability to render even the most complex and difficult philosophical ideas remarkably accessible to his audience. Unlike many of his contemporary professors who often droned on from prepared texts in a monotonous fashion, Kant spoke freely and spontaneously, actively engaging with his audience and infusing even the most abstract subjects with genuine enthusiasm and intellectual fervor. Consequently, his classrooms were frequently full, buzzing with eager students. Despite his popularity and evident talent, the coveted professorship he so earnestly desired consistently remained out of his grasp. Academic chairs would become vacant, new appointments would be made, and yet, time and again, the prestigious position would go to someone else. Occasionally, the successful candidate for these positions was genuinely more qualified. More often, however, they were simply better connected. The university environment, after all, was a relatively small world, and professional advancement frequently depended as much on political maneuvering and personal connections as it did on sheer academic merit. Kant possessed no powerful patrons, belonged to no influential noble family to advocate on his behalf, and held no connections at court. Although he received tempting offers from other universities, including Jena in 1769 and potentially Jena around the same time, he steadfastly refused them all. Königsberg was his home, the only place he had ever truly known, and indeed, the only place he ever wished to be. He was resolved to wait for a permanent position within his beloved city, or he would accept no position whatsoever. And so, he patiently waited. He lived in a succession of rented rooms, relocating from one modest lodging to another. He meticulously managed his meager income, ensuring he never fell into debt, but never quite attaining a comfortable living either. He watched with quiet determination as younger, less experienced men advanced past him. He observed his 40th birthday approach, then his 45th. Still a private docent, still patiently waiting. By the time he reached his mid-40s, Kant might well have appeared to be a permanent, albeit somewhat anachronistic, fixture of the university landscape, the brilliant, highly respected lecturer who, for inexplicable reasons, never quite attained the esteemed title of professor. He was acknowledged for his talent but consistently overlooked, gifted yet seemingly unlucky in his career progression. Many men in similar circumstances would undoubtedly have grown bitter and resentful, or simply given up on their aspirations entirely. Kant, however, displayed an extraordinary resilience. He simply continued to passionately teach his courses, diligently write his essays, meticulously develop his profound ideas, and patiently wait for the long-desired chance that, despite his efforts, might never materialize. During this protracted period of waiting for due recognition, Kant cultivated habits of such extraordinary precision and unvarying regularity that they eventually attained legendary status. It was as if the philosopher who would later famously systematize the very principles of human reason first meticulously systematized his own personal life. Indeed, the citizens of Königsberg could, with remarkable accuracy, set their clocks by Immanuel Kant. Every single afternoon, precisely at 3:30, the philosopher would emerge from his house on Princess Street, Princessstrasse, and embark upon his daily constitutional walk. He invariably followed the exact same route each day, passing the same familiar buildings at the exact same measured pace. His neighbors, keenly aware of his routine, knew precisely when to expect his punctual appearance. Shopkeepers would instinctively glance up from their work as he passed, a testament to his predictable presence. This intriguing story of Kant's unwavering punctuality spread throughout the city and eventually resonated across Europe. Here, people marveled, was a man so utterly regular and consistent in his daily habits that his afternoon walk effectively served as the town's unofficial, living timepiece. This now famous punctuality was far more than a mere personal quirk or an affected display of eccentricity. Rather, it was the tangible, visible manifestation of an entire, carefully constructed system of living, a regimen designed with the very same exacting precision and meticulous order that Kant would later apply to his groundbreaking philosophical works. Each morning, he consistently rose at 5 a.m., roused by his devoted servant with the unwavering command, "It is time." He would then dress, drink his customary morning tea, always tea, never coffee in the morning, and promptly sit down at his desk to begin his intellectual labors. The morning hours, from 5 o'clock until 1 in the afternoon, were rigorously dedicated to intensive writing and profound thinking. These were his sacred hours, fiercely protected from any and all forms of interruption. It was during this sacrosanct period that Kant meticulously produced the massive, paradigm-shifting philosophical works that would fundamentally alter Western thought: the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment. All meticulously emerged from these quiet, disciplined morning sessions, accumulated page by painstaking page over years of unwavering effort. At precisely 1 p.m., he would take his single meal of the day. Kant firmly believed that one substantial meal was entirely sufficient, and that consuming multiple meals merely burdened the digestive system unnecessarily. While he certainly ate well when he did eat, he was no ascetic. He maintained the strict practice of eating only once per day. His solitary meal was consistently followed by the famous afternoon walk, that legendary constitutional stroll that unfailingly carried him through the familiar streets of Königsberg precisely at 3:30 p.m. This daily walk served multiple, crucial purposes. Primarily, it provided much-needed exercise for a body that was never particularly robust. Kant possessed a narrow chest, a slight physical frame, and a delicate constitution that demanded meticulous care and management. It also served as a dedicated meditation time, offering a precious opportunity to ponder and work through complex philosophical problems, while his body moved almost mechanically along familiar paths. Furthermore, it was a deliberate concession to his perceived need for fresh air, which Kant genuinely believed was absolutely essential for maintaining good health. During these walks, he made a conscious effort to breathe solely through his nose, keeping his mouth firmly closed, utterly convinced that this specific practice actively prevented illness. Following his invigorating walk, Kant would transition into his social hours. Most evenings, he either graciously entertained guests at his own dining table or enjoyed dinner at the homes of his various friends. These were never brief, perfunctory encounters. Indeed, dinner conversation often extended for hours, gracefully ranging across virtually every topic imaginable: politics, cutting-edge science, contemporary literature, exotic travel, and the profound nature of human beings. Kant himself was a celebrated conversationalist, renowned for his wit and deeply engaged presence, a persona far removed from the image of a dry, detached academic that his philosophical prose might sometimes suggest. Yet by 10 p.m., he was invariably back home. Always by 10, he would be settled in bed shortly thereafter, his daily cycle meticulously completed, poised to begin anew at 5 a.m. the following morning. This extraordinary discipline, while rigid, was by no means arbitrary. It was a carefully constructed response to Kant's genuinely fragile health. He suffered from a naturally weak constitution, persistent chronic digestive troubles, and what appears to have been a marked tendency toward hypochondria, an excessive preoccupation with one's health. This rigid daily routine was, therefore, his methodical way of carefully managing a physical body that simply could not be taken for granted. By meticulously controlling every aspect of his life that was within his power, precisely when he woke, when he ate, when he walked, and when he slept, he sought to maximize his precious productive hours and, crucially, to minimize the disruptive unpredictability of illness and physical discomfort. According to enduring legend, only on 2 solitary occasions did Kant ever deviate from his meticulously scheduled afternoon walk. One such instance occurred when he received his highly anticipated copy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's influential work, Émile, or On Education. He became so utterly absorbed in reading it that he completely forgot the appointed time for his stroll. The only other recorded deviation was upon the arrival of the momentous news of the French Revolution, an event of such immense historical significance that even the famously clockwork philosopher was momentarily thrown off his ironclad schedule. These 2 rare exceptions, however, merely served to emphatically prove the rule. For decades, his rigorous schedule held firm, and within its carefully structured confines, Kant accomplished more profound intellectual work than most individuals manage to achieve in several lifetimes. Yet, this seemingly solitary, clockwork existence effectively concealed a remarkably rich inner life and a vibrant social world, aspects that many who are familiar only with Kant's reputation for austere, dry abstraction would undoubtedly find quite surprising. The prevalent image of Kant as a reclusive hermit, perpetually locked away with his books and his own solitary thoughts, stands as one of the most enduring misconceptions in the history of philosophy. In reality, Kant was profoundly social. He harbored a deep love for conversation, actively sought out company, and was a regular, cherished presence at the dinner tables of Königsberg's intellectual elite. Moreover, he hosted his own gatherings at home with evident and genuine pleasure. For a man who never once traveled beyond his native city, who never personally witnessed the wider world, the intimate setting of the dinner party served as his crucial window through which he keenly observed and understood humanity in all its varied forms. Kant even developed a specific rule concerning the optimal number of guests for his dinner parties. It should be more than the Graces, but fewer than the Muses. Drawing from Greek mythology, where there were 3 Graces and 9 Muses, Kant's ideal dinner party thus included between 4 and 8 people, himself counted among them. He believed that fewer than 4 participants made conversation too restricted and less dynamic. Conversely, more than 8 rendered the discussion unwieldy and difficult to manage effectively. At this perfectly balanced size, discussion could flow freely and organically, touching on a diverse range of subjects, and allowing each guest to contribute meaningfully without any single individual dominating the discourse. The range of topics discussed at his table was remarkably wide and varied. Politics was a perennial favorite, though Kant exercised considerable caution, especially in his later years when the threat of censorship became a very real and present danger. Science was a constant subject of lively debate, literature was reviewed and critiqued, and local gossip was often exchanged. Kant took particular pleasure in hearing detailed accounts of foreign lands, their unique customs, their diverse geographies, and the intricate lives of their inhabitants, places he had never seen with his own eyes and knew he would never personally visit. He would pose meticulous, detailed questions and possessed an extraordinary memory, recalling virtually everything he was told. Visitors who had actually undertaken extensive travels were sometimes genuinely astonished by the sheer depth of knowledge this seemingly provincial philosopher displayed about their own distant countries. His closest and most cherished friend was an English merchant named Joseph Green, who had settled in Königsberg and successfully established a thriving trading business. Green, remarkably, shared Kant's profound passion for punctuality and precise routines. He was, perhaps, the only person in the entire city whose daily habits were as meticulously exact and predictable as those of the philosopher himself. The two men dined together regularly, their deep friendship forged on a foundation of mutual respect, profound intellectual compatibility, and a shared, almost reverential, appreciation for order in all aspects of life. When Joseph Green passed away in 1786, Kant was utterly devastated, feeling he had lost one of the precious few individuals who truly understood him on a fundamental level. Beyond Green, there were other cherished friends and regular companions at Kant's dinner table, the accomplished physician Marcus Herz, who later became an important intellectual correspondent, the theologian Johann Georg Hamann, whose fervent, mystical Christianity presented a stark, intriguing contrast to Kant's rigorous rationalism, and various other academics, astute merchants, and civic officials who collectively formed the cultivated and vibrant society of this provincial capital. Kant navigated these social circles with remarkable ease, consistently appearing charming and deeply engaged, a persona utterly different from the stereotypical image of an unworldly, detached philosopher. He was also notably attentive to his personal appearance. In his younger years, Kant dressed fashionably, even elegantly, a fact that often surprises those who envision him solely in the drab, austere garments traditionally associated with a dedicated scholar. He wore powdered wigs, as was the fashionable custom of the era, and even carried a sword, as was proper for a gentleman of his standing. He paid meticulous attention to social niceties, fully comprehended the importance of proper presentation, and conducted himself with the polished manners of a man who genuinely belonged in polite society, despite his relatively humble origins. And yet, despite these social graces and intellectual breadth, he never once left his native city. He never journeyed to Berlin to meet the Prussian king. He never visited the great, prestigious universities across Europe that would undoubtedly have welcomed him with open arms. He never beheld the majestic Alps, nor the shimmering Mediterranean Sea, nor the bustling cities whose histories and cultures his books discussed with such remarkable and apparent familiarity. Instead, he gained his profound understanding of the world primarily through assiduous reading, through stimulating conversations with visitors and friends, and through the detailed reports of those who had actually traveled to distant lands. He meticulously absorbed all this disparate information, synthesized it with his own unique intellectual framework, and thereby became, in his own extraordinary way, one of the most cosmopolitan and globally aware minds in all of Europe, all without ever physically departing from his hometown. The paradox inherent in his life is truly striking. Here was a man who conceived of profound ideas in universal terms, who painstakingly developed a moral philosophy founded upon the intrinsic dignity of all human beings, universally and unconditionally, and who boldly proposed the concept of perpetual peace among nations. Yet, he himself never once set foot outside the boundaries of a single Prussian city. Perhaps, one might even argue, this apparent geographical limitation was, in a profound sense, also a liberation. Staying rooted in one specific place might have uniquely enabled him to cultivate and refine the complex, deeply interwoven thoughts that constant travel and its myriad distractions would almost certainly have interrupted and fragmented. Yet, beneath the comforting veneer of his pleasant daily routines and engaging dinner conversations, a profound intellectual crisis was steadily brewing within Kant's brilliant mind. This crisis was singularly triggered by the work of a Scottish philosopher who, in Kant's own famous words, would awaken him from his dogmatic slumber. David Hume presented a formidable intellectual challenge. This Scottish philosopher, born in 1711, had published his most radical and unsettling ideas decades before Kant ever truly encountered them. However, philosophical ideas often travel slowly, and it was not until the 1760s that Hume's revolutionary work finally began to deeply trouble the discerning mind of the Königsberg lecturer. When it did, the intellectual effect on Kant was utterly shattering. Hume was, at his core, a staunch empiricist. He held the fundamental belief that all human knowledge originates solely from sensory experience, from what we directly see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. According to Hume, there are absolutely no innate ideas, no inherent truths naturally built into the mind from birth. Instead, he posited that we begin life as blank slates, or tabulae rasa, and everything we come to know is meticulously inscribed upon us by the external world. On the surface, this empirical perspective sounds quite reasonable and intuitively plausible. However, Hume relentlessly pushed this logical framework to profoundly disturbing and unsettling conclusions. Consider, for example, the concept of causation. Intuitively, we strongly believe that one event invariably causes another. The intense heat of the fire causes the water to boil, or the impact of the ball causes the window to break. But what do we actually observe through our senses? We merely perceive the fire, and then, sequentially, we perceive the water boiling. We observe the ball striking the window, and subsequently, we observe the glass shattering. We never, in fact, directly perceive the causation itself, the inherent, invisible link. We simply observe one event followed by another. We then assume a causal connection between them. Yet, Hume argued, that crucial connection is not inherently given to us by sensory experience. Instead, it is something our own minds actively add to the observation. And if causation is ultimately nothing more than a deeply ingrained habit of the mind, rather than an objective, verifiable feature of external reality, then the very foundations upon which all empirical science is built begin to dramatically crumble. Science fundamentally depends on the unwavering assumption that specific causes reliably produce predictable effects, that what has happened consistently in the past will undoubtedly happen again in the future. But this vital assumption, Hume concluded, cannot be logically proven by experience, as experience alone only reveals what has already occurred, never what is yet to come. We hold the belief that the sun will rise tomorrow simply because it has consistently done so every day prior. Yet, from a purely logical standpoint, this is not a definitive proof, it is merely an expectation. Hume famously termed this the problem of induction, arriving at the conclusion that absolute certainty is an impossibility. While we can formulate probable beliefs grounded in our past experiences, we can never truly possess knowledge in its most stringent sense. The world we presume to comprehend might, quite conceivably, behave in an entirely different manner tomorrow, and we possess no rational guarantee against such a shift. When Kant ultimately grasped the full, devastating import of Hume's argument, he was profoundly shaken. For many years, Kant had been a steadfast proponent of the rationalist tradition, a philosophical school, notably of Leibniz and Wolff, which he had absorbed from his mentor, Martin Knudsen. This tradition posited that human reason held the power to uncover necessary truths about the world, truths that were established with unassailable logical certainty. Mathematics served as the quintessential model for this approach. The Pythagorean theorem, for instance, was considered not just probable, but inherently and necessarily true. The rationalists were convinced that a similar degree of certainty could be attained in metaphysics, particularly in our understanding of God, the soul, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. However, Hume utterly shattered this foundational confidence. If all knowledge ultimately derives from experience, and experience can never furnish absolute certainty, then the entire ambitious project of rationalism was, in essence, built upon shifting sands. The grand, intricate metaphysical systems that had been painstakingly constructed were exposed as nothing more than castles in the air. Even science, that magnificent edifice erected by Newton and his successors, rested upon foundations that proved too fragile to bear its immense weight. Kant later reflected that Hume had interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a completely different direction. The comforting, long-held assumptions were now gone. The old answers had ceased to be adequate. Something entirely new needed to be constructed. But what form would it take? How could one possibly rescue science from the encroaching specter of Humean skepticism? How could the very possibility of genuine knowledge be preserved while simultaneously acknowledging the profound limits that Hume had so powerfully exposed? These formidable questions would preoccupy Kant for the subsequent 2 decades, compelling him to forge an entirely novel philosophical system, the most ambitious endeavor ever undertaken to address Hume's challenge. Yet, a solution was not easily found. And before Kant could arrive at it, another influential thinker would fundamentally reshape his understanding of human beings themselves. Hume had shattered Kant's intellectual confidence, but a different philosopher would bestow upon him something equally transformative, a powerful new vision of human dignity that would forever alter his moral philosophy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was unlike any philosopher Kant had previously encountered. This enigmatic Jean-Van writer was characterized by a wild, untamed spirit where the Germans were systematic, passionate where they were precise, and utterly unpredictable where they prided themselves on being methodical. His personal life was a continuous scandal. He had infamously abandoned his own children to foundling homes, quarreled vehemently with virtually everyone who attempted to assist him, and compulsively wandered across Europe in a state of perpetual persecution, both real and imagined. His prose burned with raw emotion, his ideas were considered dangerous, and he profoundly transformed Immanuel Kant. Before immersing himself in Rousseau's works, Kant later confessed, he had been something of an intellectual snob. He revered learning, greatly prized the meticulous cultivation of the mind, and habitually looked down upon those who lacked formal education. The common people, the farmers, the craftsmen, the laborers, struck him as inherently less worthy of respect than the scholars and scientists devoted to the pursuit of knowledge. For Kant, the life of the mind represented the highest form of existence. Those who did not share in it were, in some fundamental sense, lesser beings. Rousseau utterly shattered this ingrained prejudice. In Émile, his groundbreaking treatise on education published in 1762, Rousseau passionately argued that the innate goodness of human beings was, in fact, corrupted by the pervasive influence of society. Children were born innocent, he contended, but civilization inevitably rendered them vicious. The elaborate structures of learning and refinement that Kant so admired were, in Rousseau's radical estimation, often instruments of corruption rather than genuine improvement. More significantly, Rousseau forcefully insisted that every single human being, irrespective of their education, social standing, or intellectual achievements, inherently possessed an unalienable dignity that could not be stripped away. The peasant was not worth less than the esteemed professor. The serving girl was in no way beneath the noblewoman. All human beings were fundamentally equal in their intrinsic moral worth. This profound realization was a revelation for Kant. Kant encountered Émile soon after its publication, and the book captivated him entirely. Legend has it that he became so completely engrossed in reading it that he famously missed his customary afternoon walk, one of only 2 occasions in his entire life when this occurred. While the story might be embellished, its profound impact was undeniably real. Kant emerged from this transformative encounter with Rousseau a fundamentally changed man. "I am myself, by inclination a seeker after truth," Kant wrote. "I felt a consuming thirst for knowledge and a restless passion to advance in it, as well as satisfaction in every step of progress. There was a time when I thought that this alone could constitute the honor of mankind, and I despised the common people who know nothing. Rousseau set me right. This blind prejudice vanished. I learned to respect humanity." The depth of this transformation was physically visible within Kant's own study. The only decorative image he allowed himself was a portrait of Rousseau, prominently displayed on the wall where he could see it as he worked. Not Newton, whom he revered as a scientist. Not Leibniz, whose philosophy had deeply shaped his early intellectual development. But Rousseau, the wild man, the outsider, the passionate prophet of human equality. The influence resonated deeply throughout his later work. When Kant subsequently developed his moral philosophy, its central, unwavering principle would be that every human being must be treated as an end in themselves, and never merely as a means to achieve someone else's purposes. This profound insight, originally Rousseau's, was meticulously transformed by Kant's systematic rigor into a bedrock philosophical principle. The categorical imperative, the supreme and universal law of morality, was, in a very real sense, Rousseau's passionate conviction filtered and formalized through the precise sieve of Kant's reason. Kant also absorbed Rousseau's revolutionary political ideas, the crucial notion that legitimate government must ultimately derive its authority from the consent of the governed, that laws must apply uniformly and equally to all citizens, and that freedom is the inherent birthright of every human being. These potent ideas, which would ignite revolutions in America and France, likewise found their way into Kant's political philosophy. The Königsberg professor who famously never traveled had discovered in the Jean van Wanderer a profound kindred spirit. Both men profoundly believed in the transformative power of ideas to reshape the world, both championed the inherent dignity of the individual, and both, in their distinct ways, would play a pivotal role in creating the intellectual foundations of the modern world. Armed with the intellectual challenge posed by Hume, and the inspiring moral vision of Rousseau, Kant was now poised to construct something entirely new. But first, at the age of 46, he would finally receive the academic recognition he had so diligently pursued for so long. In 1770, after an arduous 15-year wait, Immanuel Kant at last secured the appointment he had coveted for so many years. The prestigious chair of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg had become vacant. Kant, now 46 years old, was the unequivocally obvious candidate. He had been teaching these very subjects as a Privatdozent, private lecturer, for a decade and a half. His lectures were popular, his publications well respected, and his academic reputation steadily growing. There was simply no one in Königsberg better qualified for the esteemed position. This time, the long-awaited appointment materialized. On March 31, 1770, Kant formally became a full professor at the very university that had served as his intellectual home since his childhood. The years of academic wandering were finally over. The precarious period of subsisting on meager student fees was finished. For the first time in his adult life, Kant enjoyed a guaranteed salary, genuine job security, and the official imprimatur of the powerful Prussian academic establishment. The momentous occasion was marked by his inaugural dissertation, On the Form and Principles of the Sensible and Intelligible World. This was no mere academic formality. The dissertation itself constituted a substantial philosophical work, and it already contained the nascent seeds of the intellectual revolution that was soon to erupt. Within this work, Kant began to articulate a critical distinction between the world as we experience it through our senses, the phenomenal world, and the world as it might exist in itself, independent of any human experience, the noumenal world. He boldly argued that space and time are not intrinsic features of objective reality, but rather fundamental forms of human perception, the indispensable frameworks through which our minds actively organize all sensory experience. This was a profoundly radical claim, and it presaged the central, groundbreaking insight of the Critique of Pure Reason, still a full decade away. Colleagues across Germany took notice. The dissertation circulated among philosophers, some of whom were intrigued, while others remained utterly puzzled. What precisely was Kant asserting, and where were these peculiar ideas ultimately leading? The comprehensive answer would take many more years to fully emerge. For now, Kant settled comfortably into the well-structured life of a full professor. His teaching load was substantial but entirely manageable. His income was now sufficient to afford him modest comfort. He moved into more suitable lodgings and continued his cherished social rounds, his stimulating dinner parties, and his famous solitary walks. The external circumstances of his life had, at long last, stabilized. But internally, something truly momentous was unfolding. The profound questions that Hume had meticulously raised, the inspiring moral vision that Rousseau had ignited, and the deep-seated problems within the rationalist tradition that Kant had absorbed during his youth, All of these intellectual currents were now converging in his mind, urgently demanding a comprehensive and unified solution. He was not content simply to produce a dissertation and then rest complacently on his newfound laurels. He was, in fact, meticulously preparing for something immeasurably larger. The professorship was not an ending, it was, rather, the powerful beginning of the most productive and consequential phase of Kant's illustrious career. With his nagging financial worries finally behind him, he could at last devote his full, undivided attention to the monumental philosophical project that had been slowly taking shape in his mind for many years. What ensued was arguably the strangest decade of Kant's career, a decade during which this previously prolific writer published almost nothing of note. This prolonged silence, however, was not indicative of idleness. It was a period of intense preparation for an intellectual earthquake. Between 1770 and 1781, Immanuel Kant virtually vanished from the active philosophical scene, a development that struck many as profoundly odd. Prior to securing his professorship, Kant had been an extraordinarily prolific writer. A steady stream of essays, dissertations, reviews, and lectures had solidified his burgeoning reputation. His colleagues naturally expected that the newfound security and prestige of a full professorship would only serve to amplify his output. Instead, his published works seemed to dry up entirely. Year after year passed with no new major philosophical work appearing. Friends inquired politely, students expressed their bewilderment, and the wider philosophical community slowly began to forget about the promising Königsberg professor who had once shown such immense intellectual potential. Whatever happened to Kant? Had he simply run out of ideas? Had success made him complacent or lazy? Had he merely decided that teaching alone was sufficient? What they could not discern was the invisible labor he was undertaking. Kant was anything but idle during these silent years. He was intensely wrestling with the most difficult problem he had ever confronted, and arguably, one of the most intractable problems in the entire history of philosophy. How, indeed, could human knowledge be possible at all? Hume had convincingly demonstrated that experience alone could never yield certainty. The rationalists, conversely, had claimed that reason alone could uncover necessary truths. But pure reason, unmoored from any empirical grounding, seemed merely to spin empty fantasies, elaborate metaphysical systems that could neither be verified nor tested. Neither approach, operating in isolation, proved satisfactory. Something entirely new was desperately needed. Kant's groundbreaking solution, which he was painstakingly constructing throughout the 1770s, was a grand synthesis. He would ultimately argue that genuine knowledge necessitates both experience and reason working in concert, in a very specific and intricate manner. The mind, he contended, does not passively receive raw impressions from the external world. Rather, it actively organizes these impressions according to inherent structures that are intrinsically built into the very fabric of human cognition. Space and time, he realized, are not objective features of reality itself, but rather fundamental forms of human perception. We are simply unable to experience anything except within the frameworks of space and time because that is precisely how our minds are constituted. Similarly, fundamental concepts like causation, substance, and unity are not discovered within experience, but are actively imposed upon it by the understanding. The world we apprehend and understand is, therefore, a world we have, in part, actively constructed. This represented the famous Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had demonstrated that the apparent motion of the stars was, in reality, caused by the actual motion of the earth, Kant showed that the apparent structure of the world was, in part, a profound contribution of the observing mind itself. We do not simply conform our thoughts to objects, rather, objects, in a crucial sense, conform to our thoughts. Yet, meticulously working out these intricate details proved to be an agonizing intellectual ordeal. Kant wrote and rewrote relentlessly. He developed elaborate arguments, only to discover subtle flaws and then start over from scratch. He filled countless notebooks with drafts, detailed outlines, and fragmented thoughts. He approached the colossal problem from a multitude of angles, tirelessly searching for the precisely correct framework, the most apt terminology, the ideal structure. He despaired at times, but he steadfastly pushed onward. The years slowly accumulated. 1771. 1772. 1773, still no book. 1774. 1775. 1776. Kant turned 50, then 51, then 52, still no book. Colleagues naturally assumed he had simply given up. But he had not. Finally, in 1780, Kant began writing in earnest. The complex ideas had crystallized, the grand structure was now clear in his mind. He wrote feverishly, pouring out the massive work that had been painstakingly building for a full decade. He labored through the spring, through the summer, and deep into the fall, as page after page rapidly accumulated. By early 1781, it was done. After 10 arduous years of invisible, solitary labor, Kant finally completed his masterwork. In 1781, at the venerable age of 57, he published a book that would undeniably transform Western philosophy forever. In May of 1781, a new book appeared from a small publisher in Riga. Its title was formidable, Critique of Pure Reason. Its sheer length was intimidating, over 800 pages of exceptionally dense philosophical argument. Its author was a 57-year-old professor from Königsberg who had published almost nothing of significance in the preceding decade. No one truly knew what to expect. What they ultimately received was one of the most crucially important, and undeniably difficult, books ever written. Kant himself harbored no illusions regarding its accessibility. In its preface, he candidly acknowledged that the work was dry, obscure, contrary to all ordinary ideas, and on top of that prolix. He was not striving for popularity, he was striving for correctness. And the fundamental problem he was addressing was so profound, so deeply interwoven with the very nature of human thought and experience, that no facile or simplistic treatment was even remotely possible. The central question posed by the critique is deceptively simple: what can we know? The answer it provides is nothing short of revolutionary. Kant boldly argued that the human mind is not merely a passive receiver of information from the external world, it is, rather, an active and indispensable organizer of all experience. When we perceive the world around us, we do not simply record what is objectively there. Instead, we actively impose structures upon our experience, structures that fundamentally originate from the mind itself. Consider, for instance, the concepts of space and time. We invariably experience everything as being situated in space and unfolding in time. But Kant argued that space and time are not inherent features of reality existing independently of us. They are, rather, fundamental forms of human intuition, the indispensable frameworks through which we organize our entire sensory experience. We cannot possibly perceive anything except within the parameters of space and time, precisely because that is how our minds are fundamentally constituted. A mind constructed differently might, indeed, organize experience in alternative ways, but for human beings, space and time are utterly inescapable. Similarly with causation, we instinctively believe that every event must have a cause. But as Hume had so convincingly demonstrated, we never directly observe causation itself, we only ever perceive sequences of events. Kant's ingenious solution was to argue that causation is a fundamental category of the understanding, a concept that the mind actively brings to experience, rather than something it passively discovers within experience. We do not learn from empirical experience that every event has a cause. Rather, we could not have any coherent experience at all unless we inherently organized it according to underlying causal principles. This leads to a profound and crucial distinction between two fundamental kinds of reality: the world as it appears to us, the phenomenal world, and the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world. The world as it appears, the phenomenal world, is fundamentally structured by space, time, and the essential categories of the understanding. This is the world we directly experience, the world that science rigorously investigates, the world of our everyday lives. About this phenomenal world, we can indeed possess genuine knowledge. But beyond the phenomenal world lies the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world. This is reality entirely independent of human perception, reality stripped bare of the structures our minds inevitably impose. And about this noumenal world, Kant argued with unwavering conviction. We can know nothing. It remains forever beyond the grasp of both human experience and human reason. This radical conclusion carried immense implications. Traditional metaphysics had historically claimed to possess knowledge about profound subjects such as God, the soul, and the universe as a totality, matters that inherently transcended the bounds of experience. Kant, however, argued that such claims were, in essence, meaningless. We cannot possibly know whether God exists, whether the soul is immortal, or whether the universe had a definitive beginning. These fundamental questions lie inherently beyond the demonstrable limits of human reason. They are not precisely false, they are simply, and ultimately, unanswerable. With a single, masterful stroke, Kant had simultaneously rescued empirical science from skepticism and dismantled the grand, unprovable claims of traditional metaphysics. His critical philosophy assured science that its rigorous methods were indeed capable of producing genuine and reliable knowledge of the world as we experience it. Conversely, the speculative assertions of rationalist metaphysics and the dogmatic pronouncements of established religions were demonstrated to lie beyond the reach of human reason and proof. As subsequent generations of thinkers would come to understand, this monumental work stood as one of the most pivotal and transformative books in the entire history of human intellectual endeavor, a magnum opus that Kant himself had meticulously crafted over a decade. However, the initial reception of his colossal work was far from what Kant had envisioned. When the Critique of Pure Reason entered the intellectual landscape of 1781, it was as if a massive stone had been dropped into an incredibly deep body of water, creating barely a ripple. Kant had anticipated, even welcomed, spirited debate and controversy, but what truly took him aback was the profound incomprehension his ideas encountered. As the first reviews slowly began to surface, they proved to be profoundly discouraging, painting a bleak picture of his work's immediate impact. Critics vehemently complained that the book was virtually unreadable, condemning Kant for what they perceived as excessive abstraction, the invention of needlessly intricate terminology, and a tendency to get lost in fine distinctions that proved impenetrable to others. One particularly damaging anonymous review, published in a Göttingen journal, drew a comparison that absolutely infuriated Kant. It likened his philosophy to the subjective idealism of George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher who famously asserted that only minds and ideas truly exist, reducing the material world to a mere illusion. This was a profound misrepresentation, as Berkeley's subjective idealism denied the reality of an external world, whereas Kant was striving to achieve precisely the opposite, to demonstrate how humanity could possess genuine knowledge of an objective external world, albeit within definable limits. While the reviewer had clearly failed to grasp the core tenets of the critique, this fundamental misunderstanding, to Kant's dismay, was unfortunately widespread. Those steeped in the rationalist traditions of Leibniz and Wolff found Kant's arguments utterly disorienting and unfamiliar. Meanwhile, readers inclined toward Humean empiricism believed that Kant had failed to adequately address the skeptical challenges Hume had posed. While there was universal agreement on the book's immense difficulty, there was little consensus on its actual philosophical message. Sales languished, and many philosophers who might otherwise have engaged with the monumental work simply set it aside, overwhelmed by its sheer length and daunting obscurity. It appeared that Kant's decade of painstaking effort was tragically destined for obscurity. Personally, he felt a profound sense of frustration, bordering on bitterness. In his private correspondence, he vented his exasperation, lamenting the perceived stupidity of his critics, the superficiality of the reviews, and the learned world's baffling inability to grasp the profound significance of his accomplishments. He believed he had definitively solved some of philosophy's most intractable problems, yet seemingly no one was taking notice. Kant's reaction, however, was characteristically pragmatic. In 1783, he published a new and strategic work, Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that will be able to present itself as a science. This was not merely a summary of the original critique but rather an interpretive guide, offering a more concise, lucid, and stylistically accessible presentation of its core ideas. Kant's hope was that this guidebook would finally enable readers to grasp the profound significance of his earlier achievement, and indeed it did. Gradually, the intellectual tide began to shift. Younger philosophers, unburdened by staunch allegiance to older systems, commenced serious engagement with Kant's groundbreaking concepts. Study groups dedicated to his work emerged across German universities, and eager disciples appeared, keen to explore the full implications of this nascent philosophy. The descriptor, Kantian, soon began to circulate in print. By the mid-1780s, Kant was achieving considerable fame, though it was a recognition not of universal comprehension. He knew that would likely never be the case, but rather of his status as a genuinely revolutionary and major thinker who had introduced something entirely novel to philosophy. The Critique of Pure Reason was thus firmly on its path to becoming one of the foundational texts of modern philosophical thought. Yet Kant's philosophical journey was far from over. His first critique had meticulously explored the boundaries of knowledge, answering the fundamental question of what humanity could genuinely know about the world. Having thoroughly examined the nature of knowledge, Kant now shifted his formidable intellect to an entirely different, yet equally profound question, one that had resonated with him deeply since his childhood, perhaps since those contemplative walks with his mother beneath the starlit Königsberg sky. While the Critique of Pure Reason sought to define the limits of human knowledge, Kant was just as deeply preoccupied with this other, enduring enigma. What should we do? This fundamental ethical inquiry, a question as ancient as philosophy itself concerning what constitutes a right action, had seen countless proposed answers throughout history. Some philosophers argued that right actions were simply those that yielded positive consequences, such as general happiness, individual pleasure, or the broader welfare of society. Others posited that morality originated from divine commands, purportedly revealed in sacred scriptures and upheld by the daunting threat of heavenly retribution. Still others rooted ethics in human sentiments and natural feelings, empathy, benevolence, and those innate inclinations that steer us toward acts of kindness and away from cruelty. Kant, however, systematically rejected each of these prevailing approaches. He contended that consequences, by their very nature, were fundamentally unreliable as guides to moral action. Human beings, he observed, simply cannot always foresee the intricate results of their deeds. A meticulously well-intentioned act could inadvertently pave the way to disaster, while a purely selfish motive might, by sheer accident, yield a positive outcome. If morality hinged entirely on such unpredictable outcomes, then humanity would forever be left in the dark, unable to ascertain the rightness of an action until after it had occurred, and even then, certainty would remain elusive. Such a precarious foundation, Kant believed, was wholly insufficient for something as profoundly crucial as ethics. Divine commands, he argued, presented a distinct, though equally problematic, challenge. Even assuming the existence of God and the issuance of divine moral laws, individuals would still be compelled to employ their own reason to interpret these laws and critically assess whether they were, in fact, inherently good. For Kant, the mere dictation of a command by God did not inherently render it moral or right, unless those very commands were themselves rooted in reason. And if that were the case, he concluded, then reason, rather than a divine arbiter, must ultimately be recognized as the supreme and true source of morality. Regarding human feelings and sentiments, Kant harbored deep suspicion. Emotions, he observed, are inherently fleeting and capricious. Sympathy might surge and then wane. While one individual might instinctively feel profound compassion for strangers, another might remain entirely unmoved. If moral obligations were contingent upon such mercurial sentiments, then morality itself would be reduced to a variable, subjective experience, shifting inconsistently from person to person and moment to moment. There could be no truly universal moral law, only an arbitrary patchwork of transient preferences. Kant yearned for a foundation far more robust and unyielding. He sought a morality rooted exclusively in pure reason, a moral framework that would be universally binding upon every rational being, entirely irrespective of their personal feelings, their specific circumstances, or their individual desires. In essence, he aspired to discover a moral law possessing the same universality and absolute necessity as the immutable laws of mathematics. The profound outcome of this quest was Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative. In 1785, he unveiled this supreme principle of morality in his seminal work, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. The categorical imperative, Kant explained, is not merely a collection of specific prohibitions like, "Do not lie," or "Do not steal." Rather, it functions as a rigorous, universal test or criterion, designed to determine whether any proposed action is fundamentally morally permissible or impermissible. The first formulation of this imperative states, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." To put it more plainly, before undertaking any action, one must ask, what if everyone were to do this? What if the underlying principle or maxim of my action were adopted as a universal law by all rational beings? If the logical outcome of such universalization would be contradictory or self-defeating, then the action in question is inherently wrong. Consider, for instance, the act of lying. If everyone were to lie whenever it suited their convenience, the very concept of truth would swiftly collapse into meaninglessness. Mutual trust would erode, and lying itself would become utterly pointless, as no one would ever believe another. The efficacy of deception fundamentally relies upon a background assumption of general honesty, an assumption that would be utterly annihilated by universal lying. Consequently, the act of lying unequivocally fails the test of the categorical imperative. The second formulation of the categorical imperative approaches this same fundamental moral principle from a distinct, yet complementary, perspective. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means to an end. This powerfully rearticulates an insight drawn, in part, from Rousseau, transforming it into a cornerstone of ethical philosophy. Kant's assertion is that every human being is endowed with an intrinsic, inherent dignity. To exploit or manipulate someone as a mere instrument for one's own objectives, to deceive them, use them, or disregard their personal goals and values, is to profoundly violate that sacred dignity. True morality, therefore, demands that we unreservedly respect the autonomy and inherent worth of every rational being, a respect that extends even to ourselves. 3 years subsequently, in 1788, Kant further developed and deepened these critical moral insights with the publication of the Critique of Practical Reason. In this work, he meticulously argued that moral obligation is not an external imposition thrust upon us, but rather an intrinsic outgrowth of our own rational nature. When individuals act morally, they are not merely submitting to some external authority or dictate. Instead, they are embodying their highest form of freedom, the profound liberty to govern themselves autonomously according to the very laws they rationally prescribed for themselves. This represented a truly profound reorientation of moral philosophy. Morality was no longer construed as mere obedience to external rules, but as an expression of inner autonomy. The moral law, far from being a burdensome imposition, emerged as the ultimate expression of inherent human dignity. In these rigorous philosophical tenets, the echoes of Kant's pietist upbringing were unmistakable. The pronounced emphasis on duty, the unwavering demand for moral rigor, and the insistence that a truly right action must be performed solely for its own sake, rather than for any anticipated reward, all powerfully evoked the strict, principled household where young Immanuel had been nurtured to meticulously examine his conscience and relentlessly strive for moral perfection. Crucially, however, Kant had stripped away the supernatural framework that traditionally underpinned moral thought. The moral law, in his system, no longer necessitated divine authority. Instead, it was discovered as being intrinsically inscribed within reason itself. With the completion of his first 2 critiques, Kant had thus provided comprehensive answers to 2 of humanity's most fundamental questions. What can we know? And what should we do? Nevertheless, his monumental philosophical system was not yet entirely complete. A significant domain remained to be fully integrated: the complex realm of human feeling, the profound experience of beauty and aesthetics, and our innate tendency to perceive purpose and design within nature. To address these vital areas and bring his philosophical architecture to its culmination, Kant published his 3rd major work in 1790, the Critique of Judgment. Recapping, the first critique had meticulously explored theoretical reason, delineating the boundaries of what we can know about the world through understanding. The second had delved into practical reason, prescribing what we ought to do in the realm of morality. Now, Kant turned his attention to a unique faculty that seemed to bridge these two domains, the power of judgment. He focused particularly on how this faculty operates within our experience of beauty and our innate understanding of living organisms. This comprehensive work is structured into two principal parts, each directly addressing significant questions that had remained unresolved by the preceding critiques. The first part is devoted entirely to aesthetic judgment, posing fundamental questions such as, what precisely transpires when we declare something to be beautiful? Is beauty simply a subjective preference, a mere matter of individual taste that holds no universal claim on anyone else? Or, Kant probed, is there a deeper, more objective dimension to our experience of the beautiful? Kant's nuanced answer, as was typical of his thought, was remarkably subtle. He contended that beauty is not an inherent property of objects in the same way that size or color might be. Consequently, when we pronounce something beautiful, we are not articulating an empirical claim about the external world that could be scientifically verified. Yet, critically, Kant also argued that aesthetic judgments are not merely straightforward expressions of purely personal preference. When one declares a sunset to be beautiful, it's more than a simple report of one's liking. It carries an implicit claim that others should also find it beautiful. There is, in his view, an intrinsic quality to the aesthetic experience that renders it shareable, suggesting even a form of subjective universality. Kant precisely located this elusive universality within the inherent structure of the human mind itself. When we encounter and experience beauty, he posited, our distinct faculties of imagination and understanding spontaneously enter into a unique state of harmonious free play. The imagination freely presents the object to us in its full sensory richness and multiplicity, while the understanding, without imposing a definitive concept, nevertheless finds a kind of order or purposiveness within it. In our ordinary, everyday experiences, these cognitive faculties typically collaborate towards a specific practical purpose, identifying objects, solving problems, or navigating our environment. However, in the experience of beauty, they engage in a spontaneous, unconstrained, free play, devoid of any definitive conceptual goal. This free play generates a distinctive pleasure, a pleasure that Kant argued we legitimately expect all other human beings, possessing a similar cognitive structure, to also experience. Thus, for Kant, the beautiful represents a fascinating convergence point between the subjective and the objective. It is neither arbitrary nor is it amenable to objective proof. Instead, it reveals a profound, unexplainable, yet deeply felt harmony between the human mind and the world it apprehends. The second, equally significant, part of the critique delves into teleological judgment, that inherent human tendency to perceive and attribute purposes within nature. Specifically, when we observe a living organism, we instinctively conceive of it as if it were designed with an intention or for a particular end. For instance, an eye naturally appears to us as if it were expressly made for seeing, and a heart seems clearly constructed for the purpose of pumping blood. However, Kant posed a critical question: can we genuinely attribute conscious purposes to nature itself? Can we assert that nature intends anything in the human sense? Kant exercised extreme caution here, as was his intellectual hallmark. He explicitly did not claim that nature inherently possesses purposes in the same manner that human beings do, for such an assertion would constitute a metaphysical claim, venturing beyond the limits of what human reason can definitively know. Instead, he argued that we are entirely justified in thinking about nature as if it possessed purposes, particularly when endeavoring to comprehend the intricate complexities of organic life. The various components of an organism, he observed, are so profoundly and intricately interrelated, so mutually dependent, that their individual functions become incomprehensible without referring them to the integrated whole. This, as if, approach, Kant clarified, is not an empirical scientific discovery about nature's actual intentions, but rather a regulative principle, a necessary and indispensable heuristic device for organizing and guiding our scientific inquiry and understanding. Unlike its predecessors, the critique of judgment was almost immediately influential, particularly resonating with the burgeoning movement of young romantics who were actively working to reshape German intellectual and cultural life. Poets and philosophers alike enthusiastically embraced Kant's revolutionary ideas concerning beauty, the liberating, free play of the imagination, and the fascinating concept of nature's perceived purposiveness. Visionary thinkers such as the philosopher Friedrich Schelling, the revered poet Friedrich Schiller, and countless other intellectuals discovered in Kant's concluding critique a crucial philosophical bridge, one that skillfully connected the perceived coldness and rigor of Enlightenment rationalism with the deeply human, expressive warmth of aesthetic experience. By 1790, Immanuel Kant had ascended to the pinnacle of intellectual renown, widely recognized as the most famous philosopher in all of Europe. Yet, this very fame inadvertently brought with it a distinct form of peril. Revolutionary ideas, ignited in France, were rapidly spreading across the continent, and the autocratic Prussian authorities were observing these developments with mounting suspicion. On that fateful day, July 14, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille in Paris, an event that reverberated globally, irrevocably altering the course of world history. The French Revolution boldly declared its arrival with the electrifying promises of liberty, equality, and the inherent rights of man. It swiftly dismantled an ancient monarchy, eradicated entrenched feudal privileges, and unequivocally proclaimed that ultimate sovereignty resided with the people themselves. For intellectuals across Europe, this was an exhilarating, almost intoxicating, moment, the very spirit of the Enlightenment made manifest. They witnessed reason triumphing resoundingly over ossified tradition, and humanity unequivocally asserting its intrinsic dignity against centuries of oppressive power structures. From his quiet vantage point in Königsberg, Kant observed these unfolding events with intense and profound interest. He had, years prior, already explicitly declared his fervent allegiance to the core principles of the Enlightenment. In 1784, he had penned a concise yet impactful essay titled, "An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?" This particular piece quickly became one of his most celebrated works, not for its intricate philosophical technicality, but rather for its undeniable clarity and resonant call to intellectual freedom. In it, Kant famously declared that enlightenment is humanity's emergence from its self-imposed immaturity. He defined this immaturity as the inability to employ one's own understanding without the guidance of another, and crucially, described it as self-imposed, when its root cause lay not in a deficit of intellect but in a profound lack of courage. The enduring motto of the Enlightenment, Kant proclaimed, was Sapere Aude. Dare to know! Have the courage to use your own reason! This was a truly revolutionary pronouncement, even before the French Revolution itself had erupted. It posed a direct challenge to every form of authority that demanded unquestioning obedience without rational justification, religious institutions dictating beliefs, political powers dictating conduct, and intellectual authorities stifling independent thought. Kant was, in essence, issuing a stirring call for all human beings to think autonomously, to critically question received wisdom, and to refuse to accept any claim based on blind trust alone. Thus, when the revolution dramatically erupted in France, Kant perceived it not merely as a political upheaval, but as the powerful, practical actualization of these very Enlightenment ideals. He saw before him a nation boldly casting off the oppressive chains of arbitrary power, unequivocally asserting the autonomy that he had painstakingly placed at the absolute core of his own moral philosophy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, famously adopted in August 1789, formally enshrined principles that Kant had been developing and advocating for years. The fundamental belief that all individuals are born free and equal, that the legitimate purpose of any government is to safeguard these inherent natural rights, and that all law must fundamentally express the general will of the people. While many intellectuals initially welcomed the revolution with open arms, they later recoiled in profound horror as events unfolded. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793, followed by the brutal Reign of Terror, a grim spectacle of a revolution seemingly devouring its own children, drove countless erstwhile sympathizers into vociferous opposition. Edmund Burke famously denounced the revolution as an unmitigated catastrophe, and many former radicals publicly recanted their earlier support. Yet Kant remained resolute. He certainly deplored the horrific excesses and was deeply troubled by the pervasive violence, but he never wavered from his fundamental conviction that the underlying principles of the revolution were inherently sound, even if their practical implementation proved deeply flawed. For Kant, the true issue was not with the noble ideals of liberty and equality themselves, but rather with the tragic failure to properly realize them. In his perspective, a revolution that, however imperfectly, pursued lofty principles, even if it later betrayed them, was still ultimately preferable to a tyranny that operated without any discernible principles to begin with. Such a steadfast stance, however, was fraught with considerable danger. Prussia, a staunch monarchy, had absolutely no desire to witness revolutionary ideals permeate its own populace. Consequently, the authorities maintained a vigilant watch, and censorship measures were progressively tightening across the kingdom. Kant, as Germany's most renowned philosopher, was known to harbor sympathies that the crown considered deeply alarming. In 1793, Kant published a book that, in the eyes of the authorities, decisively crossed a dangerous line, resulting in the full, crushing weight of royal censorship descending upon him. The book, titled Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, embodied precisely everything the Prussian authorities feared. Kant had always approached religious topics with extreme circumspection, keenly aware of the perilous nature of the subject matter. Yet the inherent logic of his comprehensive philosophical system inexorably led him to directly confront profound questions concerning God, the essence of morality, and the ultimate foundations of religious faith. In his first critique, he had meticulously argued that while human theoretical reason could neither definitively prove nor disprove God's existence, the second critique had, in turn, suggested that a belief in God was, if not provable, at least a practical necessity for a genuinely moral life, even if it cannot be rationally demonstrated. In one masterful stroke, Kant had simultaneously safeguarded the future of science and meticulously dismantled the foundations of traditional metaphysics. Science, now liberated, could proceed with unwavering confidence, secure in the knowledge that its rigorous methods yielded reliable insights into the phenomenal world, the realm of human experience. Conversely, the sweeping metaphysical claims of the rationalists, along with the dogmatic assertions of conventional religion, were definitively shown to lie beyond the reach of verifiable proof or rational demonstration. This work was, as subsequent generations of thinkers would universally acknowledge, one of the most profoundly important books ever conceived in the history of human thought. Kant had dedicated a decade of intense intellectual labor to craft this monumental masterpiece. Then came its reception, which was decidedly not what he had envisioned. The Critique of Pure Reason landed in the vibrant intellectual world of 1781 with a perplexing silence, much like a stone dropped into the profound depths of an ocean, creating hardly a ripple on the surface. Kant had anticipated heated controversy, but he had certainly not expected such widespread incomprehension. The initial trickle of reviews proved profoundly disheartening. Reviewers universally complained that the book was impenetrably dense and utterly unreadable. They accused Kant of a proclivity for overly abstract concepts, the invention of obscure terminology, and a tendency to delve into such finely nuanced distinctions that they became impenetrable to all but himself. One particularly caustic and damaging anonymous review, published in a Göttingen journal, equated Kant's intricate philosophical system with the subjective idealism of George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher who controversially posited that reality consists solely of minds and ideas, rendering the material world an illusory construct. This audacious comparison ignited Kant's considerable ire. Berkeley, a subjective idealist, categorically denied the independent existence of an external world. Kant, conversely, was meticulously striving to articulate precisely the opposite, an explanation of how we could achieve genuine, albeit circumscribed, knowledge of an objective external reality. The reviewer had not grasped the book's core arguments at all, but this profound misinterpretation, unfortunately, was pervasive. Readers steeped in the rationalist traditions of Leibniz and Wolff found Kant's innovative arguments deeply disorienting, challenging the very foundations of their philosophical upbringing. Those sympathetic to Hume's empiricism, meanwhile, felt that Kant had not adequately addressed the profound skeptical challenges posed by the Scottish philosopher. While there was universal consensus on the book's formidable difficulty, there was precious little agreement regarding its actual core message. Consequently, sales languished. Even seasoned philosophers, who might otherwise have enthusiastically engaged with such a monumental work, often found themselves defeated by its sheer length and profound obscurity, reluctantly setting it aside. Kant's decade of relentless effort appeared destined for an ignominious oblivion. He became deeply frustrated, even embittered. In his private correspondence, he railed against what he perceived as the intellectual ineptitude of his critics, the superficiality of the published reviews, and the collective failure of the academic world to grasp the revolutionary scope of his accomplishments. He felt, with profound irony, that he had untangled philosophy's most enduring quandaries, yet no one seemed to comprehend the magnitude of his feat. Kant's reaction, however, was characteristically pragmatic. In 1783, he published a new work titled Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that will be able to present itself as a science. This was not merely a condensed summary of the critique, but rather a carefully constructed guidebook designed to illuminate its intricate arguments, a significantly more concise and lucid exposition of his core ideas, rendered in a style far more accessible to a broader intellectual audience. He harbored the hope that this new work would serve as a vital key, unlocking understanding of his monumental achievements for his readership. And indeed it did. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, the intellectual tide began to shift. A new generation of philosophers, less entrenched in the established philosophical paradigms, began to seriously engage with Kant's revolutionary ideas. Spontaneous study groups began to coalesce in German universities, and eager disciples emerged, keen to meticulously explore and articulate the full implications of this burgeoning new philosophy. Soon, the descriptor, Kantian, started to circulate in academic discourse and printed texts. By the mid-1780s, Kant's renown was rapidly expanding across Europe. While he would never attain universal comprehension, a fate perhaps impossible for such profound thought, he was unequivocally recognized as a groundbreaking, seminal thinker who had introduced something truly novel and transformative into philosophy. The Critique of Pure Reason was thus firmly on its trajectory to becoming one of the indispensable foundational texts of modern philosophy. Yet Kant's intellectual journey was far from complete. While the first critique had comprehensively addressed the fundamental nature of knowledge, specifically, what we are capable of knowing about the world, his philosophical system required further elaboration. Kant then shifted his focus to an entirely distinct set of questions, ones that had deeply preoccupied him since his early childhood, dating back to his reflective strolls with his mother beneath the starry Königsberg skies. Specifically, the fundamental inquiry was, what ought we to do? This profound question, one that had perpetually vexed Kant, was as ancient as philosophical thought itself. What precisely constitutes a morally right action? For millennia, philosophers and theologians had proposed various answers. Some contended that morally sound actions were those that reliably generated positive consequences, such as overall happiness, personal pleasure, or the collective welfare of society. Others maintained that morality originated from divine commands, purportedly revealed in sacred scriptures and rigorously enforced by the formidable threat of celestial retribution. Yet another school of thought rooted ethics in innate human sentiments, feelings of sympathy, benevolence, and those natural inclinations that gently steer us toward acts of kindness and away from cruelty. Kant, however, systematically rejected each of these prevailing approaches. Consequences, he powerfully argued, proved to be fundamentally unreliable arbiters of moral rectitude. We are inherently incapable of consistently predicting the ultimate outcomes of our actions. A deed performed with the purest intentions might inadvertently precipitate disaster, while a self-serving act could, by sheer accident, yield positive results. If morality were contingent upon outcomes, we would be forever precluded from knowing whether we had acted correctly until after the event, and even then, our judgments could easily be mistaken. Such an empirical dependency struck Kant as an exceedingly precarious foundation for a discipline as crucial as ethics. Divine commands, in turn, presented a distinct set of philosophical difficulties. Even assuming God's existence, and the promulgation of moral laws, humanity would still be compelled to employ its own faculty of reason to discern the nature of these laws and to assess their inherent goodness. The simple decree of a divine entity, Kant asserted, does not intrinsically confer moral rightness upon an action. Unless, of course, these divine commands are themselves underpinned by reason. And if they are indeed grounded in reason, then it is reason itself, not God, that ultimately stands as the supreme fount of morality. Regarding feelings and sentiments, Kant harbored a profound and abiding suspicion. Emotions, he observed, are ephemeral, sympathy fluctuates, waxing and waning. One individual might experience profound compassion for strangers, while another remains utterly unmoved. If moral imperatives were rooted in such fleeting sentiments, then ethical obligations would inevitably become idiosyncratic, shifting not only from person to person but from moment to moment. This would preclude any possibility of a universal moral law, reducing it instead to a mere kaleidoscope of transient preferences. Kant sought something far more robust and immutable. He yearned for a morality anchored solely in pure reason, a system of ethics that would be universally binding upon every rational being, entirely irrespective of their subjective feelings, their specific circumstances, or their idiosyncratic desires. In essence, he aspired to discover a moral law possessing the same universality and apodictic necessity as the fundamental laws of mathematics. The culmination of this quest was his groundbreaking formulation, the categorical imperative. In 1785, Kant unveiled his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, within which he meticulously articulated this supreme, foundational principle of morality. The categorical imperative is not merely a collection of specific prohibitions, like, "Do not lie," or "Do not steal." Rather, it serves as an indispensable litmus test, a rigorous criterion for ascertaining whether any contemplated action is morally permissible. Its first formulation states, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." Expressed differently, prior to undertaking any action, one must ask oneself, what if everyone were to perform this same action? What if the underlying principle guiding my action were to be universally adopted by all rational beings? Should such a universalization lead to a logical contradiction or render the principle itself self-defeating, then the action is, by definition, morally wrong. Consider, for instance, the act of lying. If it were universally permissible for everyone to lie whenever it suited their convenience, the very fabric of truth would unravel. Trust would evaporate, rendering the act of lying itself entirely futile, as no one would ever believe another. The efficacy of deception inherently relies upon a societal expectation of honesty, an expectation that universal prevarication would utterly obliterate. Consequently, lying decisively fails the rigorous test of the categorical imperative. The second formulation, approaching the identical core idea from a distinct perspective, commands, "Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always as an end and never merely as a means." This formulation distills Rousseau's profound insight into a foundational philosophical principle. Every human being is endowed with an inherent and inalienable dignity. To instrumentalize someone, treating them solely as a tool for one's own objectives, to deceive, exploit, or manipulate them without due regard for their intrinsic goals and values, is to fundamentally transgress that dignity. True morality, therefore, mandates that we unfailingly respect the autonomy of every rational being, a respect that extends even to our own person. 3 years subsequent, in 1788, Kant further elaborated and deepened these ethical concepts with the publication of his Critique of Practical Reason. In this work, he cogently argued that moral obligation is not an external imposition but rather emanates from our own inherent rational nature. Consequently, when we act morally, we are not passively submitting to some external authority. Instead, we are actively manifesting our profoundest freedom, the unparalleled freedom to self-govern according to universal laws that we, through the exercise of our own reason, prescribe for ourselves. This constituted a truly profound paradigm shift. Morality was thus recast, no longer as a matter of simple obedience, but as an assertion of individual autonomy. The moral law, far from being a burdensome constraint, emerged as the ultimate expression of human dignity and self-determination. The unmistakable echoes of Kant's rigorous pietist upbringing reverberate throughout these ideas. The unwavering emphasis on duty, the uncompromising demand for moral rigor, and the firm insistence that a truly right action must be performed solely for its inherent worth, rather than for any anticipated reward. All these elements harken back to the formative household where young Immanuel learned to meticulously scrutinize his conscience and relentlessly strive for moral perfection. Crucially, however, Kant had methodically stripped away the supernatural framework from this morality. The moral law, in his system, no longer required divine authority. Instead, it was discovered as intrinsically inscribed within reason itself. Thus, Kant had now meticulously explained both what we are capable of knowing and what we are morally obligated to do. Yet, his monumental philosophical system remained incomplete. A significant lacuna persisted, specifically concerning the profound realm of human feeling, the compelling nature of aesthetic experience, and our innate perception of purpose within the natural world. In 1790, Kant brought his comprehensive philosophical system to its culmination with the publication of his Critique of Judgment. While the first critique had meticulously explored theoretical reason, delineating the boundaries of what we can reliably know about the world, and the second had probed practical reason, articulating our moral obligations, Kant now turned his formidable intellect to a faculty that seemed to bridge these two domains, the power of judgment. He examined it specifically as it functions in our experience of beauty and in our attempts to comprehend living organisms. The Critique of Judgment is methodically structured into two distinct parts, each designed to address lingering questions that the preceding critiques had, by their nature, left unresolved. The initial section delves into aesthetic judgment, wrestling with the fundamental question: what transpires when we declare something beautiful? Is beauty merely a subjective impression, a fleeting matter of individual taste that holds no universal claim on others? Or does it possess a deeper, more profound significance? Kant's answer, in typical fashion, was exquisitely subtle and nuanced. Beauty, he argued, is not an intrinsic property of objects in the same empirical way that size or color might be. When we make an aesthetic judgment, we are not asserting an objective claim about the external world that could be empirically verified through scientific investigation. And yet, Kant posited, aesthetic judgments transcend mere expressions of personal preference. When one pronounces a sunset beautiful, it is not simply a report of individual liking. Rather, it implicitly carries a claim that others ought to find it beautiful as well, suggesting an underlying quality in the experience that renders it profoundly shareable, even universal. Kant located the source of this peculiar universality not in the object itself, but in the intricate structure of the human mind. He contended that when we encounter beauty, our cognitive faculties of imagination and understanding engage in a unique, harmonious, free play. The imagination freely presents the object to us in its full sensory richness, while the understanding, without imposing a rigid concept, playfully engages with it. In everyday cognition, these faculties typically collaborate with a specific objective, identifying objects, solving practical problems, or navigating the physical world. However, in the experience of beauty, they operate without such a determinate goal, engaging in a delightful, spontaneous, free play. This unconstrained interplay engenders a distinctive pleasure, a pleasure we instinctively expect other human beings, who share our fundamental cognitive architecture, to experience similarly. The beautiful, for Kant, thus represents a fascinating nexus between the subjective and the objective. While it is not arbitrary, it cannot be subjected to empirical proof. Instead, it subtly reveals a profound, unexplainable, yet deeply felt harmony between the human mind and the broader world. The second major section of the Critique of Judgment addresses teleological judgment, our inherent tendency to perceive purpose and design within nature. When we observe a living organism, we instinctively conceive of it as having been designed for a specific function. The eye appears intricately fashioned for sight, the heart for circulating blood. But can we legitimately ascribe conscious purposes to nature itself? Can we truly assert that nature possesses intentions? Kant proceeded with utmost caution here. He explicitly disavowed the claim that nature actually has purposes in the anthropomorphic way human beings do. Such an assertion, he recognized, would constitute a metaphysical claim extending beyond the limits of human knowledge. Instead, he argued that we are entirely justified in thinking about nature as if it possessed purposes, particularly when striving to comprehend the complex functionality of organic life. The constituent parts of an organism, he observed, are so intricately interrelated and mutually interdependent that their individual functions cannot be fully grasped without reference to the integrated whole. This purposiveness, he concluded, is not an objective scientific discovery, but rather a regulative principle, a crucial heuristic for organizing our scientific and philosophical inquiry. The third critique garnered immediate and significant influence, particularly among the nascent Romantic movement, which was then beginning to profoundly reshape German cultural thought. Poets and philosophers alike eagerly embraced Kant's revolutionary ideas concerning beauty, the spontaneous free play of imagination, and the inherent purposiveness we perceive in nature. Figures such as the philosopher Friedrich Schelling, the revered poet Friedrich Schiller, and countless others discovered in Kant's final critique a vital intellectual bridge connecting the often perceived sterility of cold rationalism with the evocative warmth and richness of aesthetic experience. By 1790, Immanuel Kant stood as arguably the most renowned philosopher across the entirety of Europe. Yet, such widespread acclaim carried its own inherent perils. With revolutionary fervor rapidly spreading from France, the watchful eyes of the Prussian authorities were fixed on any perceived threats to their established order. On a momentous day, July 14, 1789, a jubilant crowd stormed the Bastille prison in Paris, an event that reverberated globally, irrevocably altering the course of human history. The French Revolution burst forth onto the world stage, heralded by impassioned promises of liberty, equality, and the inherent rights of man. It decisively dismantled an ancient monarchy, eradicated entrenched feudal privileges, and boldly asserted that ultimate sovereignty resided with the people themselves. For intellectuals throughout Europe, it was an exhilarating and epoch-making moment, the very ideals of the Enlightenment seemingly made manifest, reason triumphing over ossified tradition, and humanity finally asserting its intrinsic dignity against centuries of systemic oppression. From his quiet abode in Königsberg, Kant observed these unfolding events with profound and unwavering interest. He had, in fact, already publicly pledged his intellectual fealty to the core principles of the Enlightenment. In 1784, he had penned a concise yet impactful essay, provocatively titled, "An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?" This piece rapidly ascended to become one of his most celebrated works, not due to its intricate philosophical technicality, but rather for its profound and resonant clarity. Enlightenment, Kant famously declared, is humanity's emergence from its self-imposed immaturity. He defined this immaturity as the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. Crucially, he emphasized that this immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in any lack of understanding, but in a lack of courage to use one's own reason without guidance from another. The quintessential motto of the Enlightenment, Kant proclaimed, was sapere aude, dare to know, a clarion call to have the courage to use your own reason. This was, in essence, a revolutionary manifesto, even preceding the actual French Revolution. It boldly challenged every conceivable form of authority that sought to command obedience without offering rational justification, religious institutions dictating belief, political regimes prescribing modes of life, and intellectual establishments stifling independent thought. Kant was, in effect, summoning human beings to exercise their innate capacity for independent thought, to critically interrogate inherited wisdom, and to refuse any claim based solely on unthinking trust. When the revolution finally erupted in France, Kant perceived it as the tangible, practical realization of these very Enlightenment ideals. Here, he witnessed a nation boldly casting off the shackles of arbitrary power, powerfully asserting the very autonomy that he had painstakingly made the central pillar of his own profound moral philosophy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, famously adopted in August 1789, formally enshrined principles that Kant had been meticulously articulating for years. the inherent freedom and equality of all individuals, the foundational purpose of government to safeguard natural rights, and the imperative that law must invariably express the general will of the populace. However, many intellectuals who had initially greeted the revolution with fervent enthusiasm later recoiled in profound horror. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793, the subsequent brutal reign of terror, and the grim spectacle of the revolution metaphorically devouring its own children, all these events alienated former sympathizers, driving them into staunch opposition. Edmund Burke, for instance, famously denounced the revolution as an unmitigated catastrophe. Other erstwhile radicals publicly recanted their support. Kant, notably, did not. He certainly deplored the horrific excesses. The pervasive violence profoundly disturbed him. Yet he steadfastly refused to abandon his fundamental conviction that the underlying principles of the revolution were intrinsically sound, even if their practical implementation was tragically flawed. The fundamental issue, in his view, lay not with the sublime ideals of liberty and equality themselves, but rather with the lamentable failure to properly actualize them. Indeed, a revolution that, however tragically, betrayed its own lofty principles remained, in Kant's nuanced judgment, preferable to a tyranny that possessed no principles whatsoever to betray. This was, undoubtedly, a politically precarious stance to adopt. Prussia remained an absolute monarchy, and its king harbored no desire whatsoever to witness revolutionary doctrines permeating among his own subjects. Consequently, the authorities maintained a vigilant watch, and censorship regulations were progressively tightening. And Kant, now undeniably the most celebrated philosopher in all of Germany, was openly known to harbor sympathies that the royal court found deeply alarming. Then, in 1793, Kant published a book that, in the eyes of the authorities, definitively crossed the line, and the full oppressive weight of royal censorship descended upon him with devastating force. The book, titled Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, embodied precisely every fear held by the Prussian establishment. Kant had consistently exercised extreme caution when addressing matters of religion, well aware of its politically perilous nature. Yet the inexorable logic of his overarching philosophical system ultimately compelled him to confront fundamental questions concerning God, morality, and the rational foundations of faith. In the first critique, he had demonstrated that while we cannot definitively prove God's existence through theoretical reason, neither can we empirically disprove it. In the second critique, he had gone further, suggesting that belief in God, though not provable, served as a practical necessity for leading a genuinely moral life, even if it cannot be. These concepts were not merely theoretical. Kant had rigorously demonstrated them. Then, in 1793, Kant embarked on an ambitious and comprehensive examination of religion, intending to scrutinize its very foundations exclusively through the uncompromising lens of pure reason alone. His argument, though presented with intellectual subtlety, proved to be profoundly explosive in its implications. He meticulously distinguished between religion understood as a foundational set of moral principles, a concept he unequivocally endorsed, and religion as a rigid system of rituals, inflexible dogmas, and supernatural beliefs, which he subjected to unsparing and rigorous criticism. For Kant, true religion was, in essence, nothing more than morality perceived under the guise of divine imperative. He contended that the moral laws binding nature stemmed from its inherent rationality, rather than from any divine enforcement. Consequently, if religious doctrines ever found themselves in conflict with fundamental morality, then, Kant declared, it was unequivocally the doctrines that were found wanting. This philosophical stance was by no means atheism. Kant maintained a belief in God, or at the very least, he believed that humanity was morally justified in conducting itself as if God existed. But his conception of the divine was that of a moral God, accessible through the dictates of practical reason, not through supernatural revelation. The Bible, in Kant's view, held value primarily insofar as it served to impart moral truths. Its historical narratives and supernatural assertions were, at best, of secondary importance. The intricate theology of the Lutheran Church, with its specific doctrines such as original sin, vicarious atonement, and miraculous intervention, was either radically reinterpreted to the point of being unrecognizable or simply, quietly dismissed as irrelevant to true religion. The official reaction to Kant's work was immediate and forceful. Frederick the Great, the enlightened monarch renowned for safeguarding intellectual freedom, had passed away in 1786. His successor, Frederick William II, represented a distinctly different type of ruler. Conventionally pious, he harbored deep suspicion toward philosophical innovation and was resolutely determined to uphold and enforce religious orthodoxy throughout his realm. His minister, Johann Christoph Wallner, had already taken measures to curtail intellectual liberty by issuing edicts that significantly restricted freedom of thought and reinforced state censorship. Initially, the early sections of Kant's book had managed to elude the notice of the censors in Berlin, who evidently deemed them too abstract to pose any significant danger. But upon the complete work's publication, the authorities quickly grasped the inherent threat. This was no mere exercise in obscure metaphysics. Rather, it was a direct and formidable assault on the very foundations of the established state religion, penned by none other than the most prestigious and influential philosopher in all of Germany. In October 1794, Kant received a formal letter, conspicuously bearing the royal seal. The message contained a stern rebuke, personally penned or at least signed by the king himself. Kant stood accused of misusing his philosophical acumen to distort and disparage many of the cardinal and fundamental teachings of Holy Scripture and the Christian faith. He was warned that continued disobedience would result in unspecified but decidedly unpleasant measures. He was explicitly ordered to cease all lecturing and writing on religious subjects. At 70 years old, Kant had dedicated his entire career to the University of Königsberg, his very position contingent upon royal favor. The consequences of defiance were severe. He faced potential dismissal, public disgrace, or even worse. The threat was unequivocally real. His subsequent response, however, proved to be a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity. In his reply to the king, Kant courteously acknowledged the royal displeasure. He solemnly declared that, "As your Majesty's most loyal subject," he would henceforth abstain from all public pronouncements concerning religion, whether delivered in lectures or articulated in his writings. The crucial phrase, however, lay in those qualifying words, "As your Majesty's most loyal subject." Kant was not pledging unconditional or perpetual silence, but rather a deferral of his public engagement with religious topics specifically for the duration of this particular king's reign. The obligation he undertook was personal and temporary, not a permanent vow. Frederick William II passed away in November 1797. Kant, ever precise in his commitments, immediately considered himself released from his promise. He promptly resumed writing on religion, although by this time, his health was in decline and his most productive years were behind him. He had strategically outmaneuvered his censors, but he could not, ultimately, outlast time itself. As the 19th century dawned, the great philosopher's physical and mental faculties began their inevitable decline. The concluding years of Immanuel Kant's life were characterized by a gradual and poignant diminishment. By the close of the 1790s, the philosopher renowned for his almost clockwork precision in his daily walks could scarcely manage a stroll around his immediate neighborhood. The eyes that had diligently absorbed the wisdom of thousands of books now struggled painfully to focus on even a single page. His once formidable memory, capable of encompassing an entire, intricate philosophical system, now occasionally faltered, unable to recall the names of long-standing friends. In 1796, Kant delivered his final lecture at the University of Königsberg. At 72 years old, the immense effort required for teaching had simply become too burdensome. The lecture hall where he had eloquently expounded his ideas for 4 decades would hear his authoritative voice no more. He withdrew into the sanctuary of his study, enveloped by the very books and papers that had been his steadfast companions throughout his intellectual life. Yet he was not idle. Indeed, he seemed incapable of idleness even then. He dedicated himself to a final, ambitious philosophical project, an earnest attempt to construct a bridge between his seminal critique of pure reason and his overarching philosophy of nature. Scholars would later posthumously refer to this unfinished endeavor as the opus posthumum, although Kant himself never brought it to completion nor bestowed a formal title upon it. What remained were accumulating fragments, half-developed ideas, and arguments that often trailed off into profound silence. The meticulous systematic rigor that had consistently characterized his celebrated published works was now, heartbreakingly, increasingly beyond his intellectual grasp. Friends and former students, cherishing their connections, visited him whenever possible. Some found him remarkably lucid, still capable of engaging in profound philosophical discussions and fondly recalling shared memories from earlier times. Others, however, found him disoriented, struggling intently to follow the natural flow of conversation, and occasionally mistaking the immediate present for the distant past. The progression of his decline was uneven, punctuated by sporadic moments of startling mental clarity, yet the overall, downward trajectory was undeniably clear. His famous daily routine, once a paragon of precision, gradually became simpler, abbreviated, and less structured. His renowned afternoon walks, once a fixture of Königsberg life, eventually ceased altogether. His cherished dinner parties, vibrant hubs of intellectual exchange, grew increasingly rare before discontinuing entirely. His once lively circle of intellectual companions inevitably shrank as old friends passed away, and Kant himself became progressively less capable of actively maintaining these vital relationships. A loyal but notoriously difficult servant named Martin Lampe had served Kant for several decades. Following a significant quarrel, Kant, in an act that reflected his fading patience, eventually dismissed him. The separation proved deeply painful for the aging philosopher. Poignantly, Kant resorted to writing himself notes, reminders not to think about Lampe, a heartbreaking testament to his lucid awareness of his own encroaching mental decline. A new servant, Johann Kaufmann, and later the devoted family of Kant's sister, stepped in to provide essential care during his concluding years. He now required assistance even with the most basic daily tasks. The man who had always cherished his independence above almost all else was now, ironically, profoundly dependent on others for the simplest activities of everyday life. Yet, even in this diminished state, his inherent dignity remained remarkably intact. Throughout his decline, Kant never relinquished his fundamental courtesy, his ingrained sense of propriety, or his profound respect for those in his immediate environment. While he might no longer recall their names, he consistently treated everyone with unwavering consideration. The very moral law that he had so meticulously and rigorously articulated continued, remarkably, to govern his conduct, even as the formidable rational powers that had first discovered and expounded it were slowly, irrevocably fading. The winter of 1803 proved exceptionally harsh. Kant's physical condition visibly deteriorated. He consumed very little food and spoke even less. Those who witnessed his decline understood with somber certainty that the end was drawing near. On February 12, 1804, the long vigil finally concluded. Immanuel Kant drew his last breath in the very city where he had lived every single day of his nearly 80 years. That particular morning, February 12, 1804, dawned gray and cold over Königsberg. Within his house on Princess Street, Immanuel Kant lay in his bed, his once great strength now almost entirely depleted. He had been slowly fading for months, consuming virtually no food, speaking only in disjointed fragments, and drifting intermittently between states of awareness and unconsciousness. His attending physician, Dr. Wilhelm Gotthold Kielbloch, had exerted every possible effort, but by now, there was simply nothing further that could be done. The physical vessel that had so long housed one of history's most profound minds was, quite simply, utterly worn out. A small circle of devoted friends maintained a quiet vigil. The philosopher's concluding days had been remarkably peaceful, characterized by prolonged periods of silence punctuated only by occasional, softly murmured words. He appeared to be free from any obvious pain, which offered a measure of comfort, but it was abundantly clear that he was swiftly nearing his end. Sometime that morning, Dr. Kielbloch gently offered Kant a mixture of wine and water, perhaps a palliative intended to ease his transition, or perhaps merely an ingrained gesture of care. Kant, struggling visibly to speak, tasted the liquid. He paused momentarily, as if deeply considering its essence or significance. Then, with immense effort, he uttered his very last words. Yes, it's good, it is good. What precisely did he mean by this? Was he simply approving the taste of the wine, or perhaps expressing profound satisfaction with a life fully lived, or even offering a final, encompassing judgment on existence itself? No one can say with certainty. His parting words remain open to a multitude of interpretations, and Kant himself was no longer present to provide clarification. Shortly after speaking them, he quietly lost consciousness. By 11 o'clock that morning, he was gone. He was 79 years old. He had lived his entire life within the confines of a single city, never venturing more than a few hours' journey from his birthplace. He had never married, never raised children, never held political office, commanded armies, or amassed personal wealth. By conventional worldly standards, his life might appear extraordinarily limited in scope. And yet, the news of his passing reverberated across Europe like a profound shockwave, reaching every intellectual corner. His funeral, conducted on February 28th, attracted thousands of mourners. The entire academic community of Königsberg turned out in force, joined by prominent civic officials, military officers, throngs of students, and countless ordinary citizens, all of whom understood, even if they could not fully articulate it, that something profoundly important had been irrevocably lost. His coffin was solemnly borne through streets lined with silent, respectful crowds, as church bells tolled mournfully. The philosopher who had dared to question every established assumption, even those foundational to religion, was nonetheless accorded the full honors of a Christian burial. He was laid to rest within the Königsberg Cathedral, alongside the city's other distinguished deceased. Initially, a simple marker identified his grave. In subsequent years, a more elaborate monument would be erected, famously inscribed with the profound words from his critique of practical reason that have since become his enduring epitaph. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. This man, who never once departed from his hometown, had, paradoxically, conquered the intellectual world, not through brute force or accumulated wealth, but through the sheer power and penetration of his ideas. These were ideas so extraordinarily powerful that they would fundamentally reshape the landscapes of philosophy, politics, religion, and even science for centuries to come. Immanuel Kant himself was gone, yet the intellectual revolution he had so singularly ignited was, in truth, only just beginning to unfold. Indeed, within just a decade of Kant's passing, the entire philosophical landscape of Europe had undergone a dramatic transformation. A new, vibrant generation of thinkers, profoundly shaped by their engagement with Kant's critiques, was actively pushing his foundational ideas into innovative directions that Kant himself might not have fully anticipated, or even entirely approved. The influential movement known as German idealism emerged directly from a deep engagement with Kantian philosophy, initially accepting its core premises before radically extending them. Johann Gottlieb Fichte was the seminal figure in this development. He had been one of Kant's most fervent followers, and his earliest philosophical writings were so thoroughly Kantian in spirit and method that readers initially presumed they were the work of the master himself. However, Fichte eventually grew dissatisfied with what he perceived as a crucial inconsistency within Kant's intricate system. If the thing in itself, the world as it purportedly exists, entirely independent of our experience, is truly unknowable, Fichte reasoned, then why should we even posit its existence? Fichte boldly proposed to eliminate this concept entirely, arguing instead that all reality is ultimately the dynamic product of the self's own inherent activity. The world, in his view, is not passively given to us, rather, we actively construct it through our consciousness. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, taking a distinct philosophical trajectory, brought his training in theology and profound fascination with nature to bear on Kant's work. Schelling endeavored to reunite the subjective and objective dimensions of Kant's philosophy. He developed an expansive philosophy of nature that conceptualized the material world not as inert, dead matter, but as the vibrant, visible expression of a deeper, underlying spiritual reality. For Schelling, art, rather than science, represented the supreme form of knowledge, precisely because only art possessed the unique capacity to capture and express the fundamental unity of subject and object. And then came George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, arguably the most profound and certainly the most controversial among the post-Kantian thinkers. Hegel masterfully absorbed Kant's foundational framework but emphatically rejected its inherent limitations. Where Kant had meticulously drawn precise boundaries around what human reason could legitimately know, Hegel audaciously proclaimed that reason, in its ultimate trajectory, knows no such boundaries. For Hegel, reality itself was ultimately rational, and the entire history of the world represented the progressive self-realization of spirit, unfolding dynamically through a process of contradiction and subsequent synthesis, inexorably moving toward absolute knowledge. It was a vision of breathtaking intellectual ambition. Kant, who had dedicated his entire career to rigorously warning against precisely such forms of metaphysical overreach, would almost certainly have profoundly disapproved of Hegel's grand speculative system. Yet, even Hegel, in his most audacious flights of speculative reason, was fundamentally responding to Kant, working directly through Kantian problems, and ultimately unable to fully escape the profound conceptual framework that the Königsberg professor had so decisively established. Indeed, virtually every German philosopher of the 19th century operated, in some significant sense, within Kant's towering shadow, whether they positioned themselves as his devoted disciples or his most stringent critics. Kant's pervasive influence, moreover, extended far beyond the confines of the academic ivory tower. The Romantic poets and artists who flourished in the decades immediately following Kant's death drew deeply and inspirationally from his ideas, particularly from his profound critique of judgment, the Third Critique, with its groundbreaking analysis of beauty, the nature of genius, and the boundless scope of the creative imagination. Friedrich Schiller, for instance, penned influential philosophical letters profoundly inspired by Kant's aesthetics. Across the Channel, Samuel Taylor Coleridge introduced pivotal Kantian ideas to England, where they subsequently shaped and galvanized an entire generation of literary thinkers and poets. Kant's groundbreaking moral philosophy became the unshakable foundation for what contemporary philosophers now term deontological ethics, the compelling view that morality is fundamentally concerned with inherent duty and unyielding principle, rather than merely with the outcomes or consequences of actions. Consequently, every subsequent significant debate regarding the true nature of ethics has been compelled to grapple directly with Kant's formidable categorical imperative, and its far-reaching implications. His political philosophy, with its revolutionary emphasis on inviolable individual rights, the necessity of constitutional government, and the audacious proposition of a possibility for perpetual peace, profoundly fed into and enriched the burgeoning liberal tradition that would dramatically reshape European politics throughout the subsequent century. The widespread revolutions of 1848, the powerful movements advocating for national self-determination, the gradual, often fraught, spread of democratic governance across the continent, all these historical developments drew, whether consciously acknowledged or not, from the foundational ideas that Kant had so eloquently articulated. By the mid-19th century, a resonant rallying cry began to emerge among philosophers who had grown increasingly dissatisfied with what they perceived as the speculative excesses and grand narratives of Hegel and his followers. Back to Kant. The resulting Neo-Kantian movement would go on to dominate German philosophy for several decades, steadfastly insisting on the paramount importance of epistemology, the critical acknowledgement of the limits of metaphysics, and the rigorous, critical method that Kant himself had so brilliantly pioneered. Crucially, Kant's profound influence was by no means confined solely to academic philosophy departments. His transformative ideas have demonstrably shaped the very fabric of the world we inhabit today. Indeed, one need only walk into the United Nations headquarters in New York to find a concept, inscribed within those halls of international power, that Immanuel Kant articulated with unmatched clarity more than 2 centuries ago: the inviolable principle of human dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, famously adopted in 1948, fundamentally rests upon this very principle, that all human beings are inherently born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is not a mere scientific claim, empirically provable through experimentation. Rather, It represents a profound moral commitment, a conscious and collective decision to treat every single person as possessing an inherent, inalienable worth that can never be justly taken away. The language of human rights powerfully echoes Kant's categorical imperative, specifically his formulation: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Moreover, the foundational institutions of international cooperation that emerged from the cataclysmic wreckage of 2 world wars, such as the League of Nations, its successor the United Nations, and the evolving European Union, all undeniably reflect another pivotal Kantian idea. In 1795, Kant published a succinct but profoundly influential work titled Toward Perpetual Peace, in which he meticulously outlined the essential conditions for achieving lasting peace among sovereign nations. He boldly proposed the establishment of a federation of free states, bound by common principles, respecting each other's distinct sovereignty, yet simultaneously collaborating to prevent the scourge of war. At the time of its publication, this vision appeared remarkably utopian. Today, it resonates with a far greater sense of practical possibility. Furthermore, the crucial distinction Kant drew between phenomena and noumena, essentially, between the world as we experience and perceive it through our senses and understanding, and the world as it might exist in itself, independent of our cognitive faculties, continues to profoundly shape how we conceptualize the fundamental limits of human knowledge. Scientists who humbly acknowledge that their theories are merely explanatory models, rather than absolute or final truths, are, consciously or unconsciously, operating within a broadly Kantian epistemological framework. Similarly, philosophers who meticulously distinguish between what we can genuinely know through reason and experience, and what we can only legitimately believe or have faith in, are applying distinctions that Kant was the first to articulate with rigorous philosophical precision. Even cognitive science, the dynamic interdisciplinary study of the mind, owes a deeper intellectual debt to Kant than many of its modern practitioners may fully realize. The foundational idea that the mind actively structures experience, that perception is not a passive reception of external data but rather an active, constructive process, is a profoundly Kantian insight. When contemporary researchers investigate precisely how the brain organizes raw sensory information into coherent objects and meaningful categories, they are, in effect, exploring the very mechanisms underlying what Kant termed the synthesis of intuitions. Indeed, even in our everyday moral reasoning, Kantian patterns of thought are remarkably pervasive. When we instinctively ask ourselves, what if everyone did this? When we consciously test the ethical validity of our actions against a standard of universal applicability, we are, whether we know it or not, thinking in profoundly Kantian terms, applying a version of his categorical imperative. When we rightly object to being manipulated or exploited, when we firmly insist on being treated with inherent respect, when we demand that our fundamental autonomy as rational beings be recognized, we are, in essence, invoking and upholding principles that Kant articulated with an unmatched clarity and philosophical force. The man who, quite literally, never traveled beyond his hometown, has, through his enduring thought, paradoxically traveled everywhere. His transformative ideas have traversed oceans, profoundly shaped national constitutions, and galvanized influential movements advocating for civil rights and the universal recognition of human dignity. His philosophical presence can be felt in courtrooms where judges invoke human rights, in classrooms where students earnestly debate complex ethical dilemmas, and even in laboratories where scientists thoughtfully reflect on the foundational methodologies of their research. Kant himself would likely have found all of this deeply gratifying, a testament to the power of reason, and perhaps, at times, even a little alarming in its scope and unexpected applications. Yet, he fundamentally believed in the potential for human progress and in the gradual, ceaseless improvement of mankind through the diligent and courageous exercise of reason. He undoubtedly would have celebrated the global proliferation of constitutional governments and the eloquent articulation of universal human rights. Yet, he would have concurrently underscored, as was his unwavering conviction, the inherent limits of human reason, the profound importance of intellectual humility, and the perilous arrogance of claiming knowledge beyond our true grasp. Thus, Our exploration concludes with a poignant reflection on the life of this extraordinary man who, despite never venturing far from his home, profoundly reshaped the intellectual landscape. Immanuel Kant's remains lie interred in Kaliningrad, the Russian city historically known as Königsberg. The cathedral housing his tomb has remarkably endured through centuries of wars and revolutions, periods of profound neglect, and subsequent ambitious restorations. Beyond its ancient walls, the city itself has been utterly transformed, evolving almost beyond recognition. The charming medieval streets where Kant once enjoyed his methodical afternoon strolls were tragically obliterated during the devastation of the Second World War. The very castle that lent the city its original name has vanished, and the esteemed university where he taught for decades has been supplanted by a Russian institution bearing an entirely new designation. Virtually none of the tangible world Kant knew persists today. And yet, paradoxically, in a much profounder sense, his intellectual world has never been more pervasive or more relevant. The groundbreaking ideas he meticulously cultivated in that modest Prussian city have permeated our collective consciousness, becoming an intrinsic part of the intellectual atmosphere we inhabit. We find his concepts as inescapable as the fundamental architecture of our own cognition. Consider now the striking paradoxes that defined his extraordinary life. He never journeyed beyond his hometown, yet his transformative thoughts resonated across every corner of the globe. He remained unmarried throughout his life, yet he possessed a profound and nuanced understanding of the intricate demands of human relationships. He adhered to a meticulously rigid daily routine, yet he passionately championed freedom as the paramount human value. He was, by definition, a provincial figure, yet his philosophical inquiries transcended local boundaries, engaging with universal concepts. His personal circumstances were modest, yet his intellectual ambition knew no bounds. The epitaph inscribed upon his tomb perfectly encapsulates the very essence of his thought. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. These are far from random observations. They symbolize the two fundamental poles of Kant's entire philosophical system. On one hand, there is the external world of nature, governed by immutable laws that human reason is capable of discovering. On the other, there is the internal world of morality, guided by self-imposed laws that human reason can prescribe for itself. The starry heavens evoke a sense of the sublime precisely because they diminish us, starkly reminding us of our inherent insignificance within the vast cosmic order. Conversely, the moral law is equally sublime because it uplifts and dignifies us, profoundly revealing our status as rational beings uniquely capable of acting upon universal principles. Kant profoundly demonstrated that we are not simply passive objects within the universe, tossed about by forces entirely beyond our command. Instead, we are active subjects, autonomous agents endowed with the capacities for reason, for making free choices, and for profound moral commitment. We possess the innate ability to inquire, "What is true?" and to diligently seek its discovery. We can ask, "What is right?" and conscientiously strive to enact it. We can contemplate, "What is beautiful?" and cultivate the capacity to appreciate it deeply. These unique human capacities fundamentally distinguish us, making us inherently responsible for our own actions and for our relationships with one another. Yet he also elucidated the inescapable limits of our knowledge, particularly concerning the thing in itself, the ultimate, noumenal nature of reality, which, he argued, will forever remain beyond our direct comprehension. While this might initially appear to be a philosophical defeat, Kant perceived it as a profound liberation. By humbly acknowledging the boundaries of what we are capable of knowing through pure reason, we effectively create the necessary intellectual and spiritual space for what we must ultimately believe, for faith, for hope, and for the essential practical commitments that collectively enable a truly meaningful existence. If this intellectual journey through Kant's extraordinary life has offered you new perspectives or something profound to contemplate, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would genuinely appreciate hearing which of Kant's myriad ideas resonates most deeply with you. Do share your reflections in the comments section below. Until our next historical exploration, I extend my wishes for a calm and peaceful night. Immanuel Kant rests in Königsberg, now known as Königsberg. It was in this quiet corner, far removed from the bustling metropolises, that his revolutionary ideas took root, yet his intellectual shadow stretches powerfully across centuries. He taught us that the most profound journeys are not to be measured by physical distance, but rather by the sheer depth and expanse of human thought. He revealed that within every individual human mind resides a universe as boundless and awe-inspiring as the starry heavens themselves. And most importantly, he reminded us that the moral law within is not a burdensome imposition but, in fact, a precious gift, the incomparable gift of being truly, irreducibly human. Good night.